Have you ever wondered what secrets lie buried beneath our feet, waiting centuries to reveal truths that could rewrite history as we know it? What if I told you that a routine archaeological excavation in eastern Tennessee uncovered evidence that changes everything we thought we knew about Native American involvement in the Civil War, and the shocking role one Cherokee woman played in a conflict that tore our nation apart? This is the extraordinary story of what archaeologists found buried alongside a Union Army uniform belonging to a Cherokee woman. Artifacts so unexpected and disturbing that historians initially refused to believe their authenticity. Before you continue watching this incredible true story that's been deliberately obscured from our history books, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and subscribe to our channel. We need your support to continue bringing these hidden chapters of American history to light, stories that powerful institutions would prefer remain buried forever. The story begins in the fall of 2017, when construction workers breaking ground for a new shopping center near Cleveland, Tennessee, struck something metallic approximately 6 feet below the surface. Following state regulations requiring archaeological assessment of potentially historic sites, work was halted, and a team from the University of Tennessee's Archaeological Research Laboratory was called to investigate. "We expected to find typical Civil War-era artifacts," recalled Dr. Michael Runningwolf, the Cherokee archaeologist who led the excavation. Eastern Tennessee saw significant military activity during the war, with divided loyalties between Union and Confederate forces. Finding buttons, bullets, or even weapons wouldn't have been unusual. What we discovered instead was something none of us was prepared for. Initial excavation revealed the partial remains of what appeared to be a hastily constructed wooden structure, possibly a cabin or small outbuilding that had collapsed and been buried over time. Carbon dating of the wood indicated construction sometime between 1861 and 1863, precisely during the Civil War period. As the team carefully removed layers of soil and debris, they discovered human remains. The skeleton was immediately distinctive, noted Dr. Sarah Blackfeather, the forensic anthropologist assigned to the project. The individual was female, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, with skeletal indicators suggesting an age between 25 and 35 years at time of death. Cranial and dental morphology strongly indicated Native American ancestry, specifically consistent with Cherokee physical characteristics. What made the discovery truly remarkable, however, was what had been buried with the woman. She was dressed in the remnants of a Union Army uniform, specifically a modified version of the standard infantry jacket and trousers issued to soldiers of the Army of the Cumberland, which operated extensively throughout Tennessee. The uniform had been altered to fit a smaller frame, with evidence of hand-stitching that suggested field modifications rather than official military tailoring. Finding a Native American woman in a Union uniform was unusual enough, Runningwolf explained, but it was what we found carefully arranged around the body that left us truly stunned. Positioned around the skeleton, in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern, were 37 human finger bones, each one blackened and preserved through a process that suggested intentional mummification. Each bone had been carefully wrapped in a small square of cotton cloth and tied with horsehair. Most disturbing of all, each package had been labeled with a small wooden tag bearing a name, rank, and unit designation of Confederate soldiers. The implications were impossible to ignore, said Dr. Elizabeth Tallchief, historian of Native American involvement in the Civil War. "We were looking at trophies taken from enemy combatants, a practice documented among certain warrior cultures throughout history, but never before confirmed among Cherokee participants in the Civil War, and certainly never associated with a female combatant." Initial reactions from the academic community ranged from skepticism to outright disbelief. Several prominent historians suggested the site had been tampered with or even deliberately staged as a hoax. Others proposed that the artifacts had been mixed from different historical periods through soil disruption or earlier construction at the site. Dr. James White Rever, curator of military artifacts at the Smithsonian Institution, was among the skeptics. The idea of a female Cherokee fighting in Union uniform is unusual, but not entirely without precedent. Several hundred women are documented to have disguised themselves as men to fight for both sides during the Civil War. Similarly, approximately 3,000 Native Americans served in Union forces. What made this claim extraordinary, and thus requiring extraordinary evidence, was the collection of human remains arranged in what appeared to be a ritual context. This suggested not just military service, but a level of warrior culture practice that would have been extremely unusual in the context of organized Civil War military units. To resolve these questions, the research team employed a comprehensive battery of scientific tests. DNA analysis confirmed that the skeleton was indeed female, with genetic markers consistent with Cherokee ancestry. Carbon dating of both the uniform fabric and the preserved finger bones placed them within the same time period, between 1862 and 1864. Most conclusively, detailed analysis of soil layers above and around the burial showed no evidence of later disturbance or intrusion that might have introduced materials from different time periods. The scientific evidence was unequivocal, Running Wolf stated. This was a genuine Civil War-era burial of a Cherokee woman in a modified Union uniform, surrounded by what could only be described as war trophies taken from Confederate soldiers. The next question was obvious. Who was she? Identifying the woman proved challenging, but not impossible. The research team cross-referenced Union Army muster rolls with Cherokee tribal records from the period, focusing particularly on the eastern band of Cherokee, who had managed to avoid the forced removal along the Trail of Tears in the 1830s by retreating into the most remote regions of the Smoky Mountains. Their breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the diary of Colonel William Thomas, a white man who had been legally adopted by the Cherokee and who commanded the Thomas Legion, a Confederate unit composed primarily of Cherokee soldiers from western North Carolina. Thomas's diary, housed in the archives of the University of North Carolina, contained multiple references to a female Cherokee scout working for Union forces who had become something of a bogeyman among his men. "My scouts report another ambush along the Tennessee border," Thomas wrote in an entry dated July 18, 1863. "3 men killed, all found missing their trigger fingers. The men are increasingly convinced these attacks are the work of the woman they call Tsiu Gansini, the ghost woman. Whether she is one person or many, or merely a phantom conjured from frontier fears, I cannot say. What is certain is that these precise, brutal attacks are undermining morale more effectively than a regiment of conventional forces." Further research uncovered additional references to this mysterious figure in both military correspondence and personal letters written by soldiers serving in eastern Tennessee. A letter from Lieutenant Samuel Richards of the 23rd Kentucky Infantry to his wife, dated September 3, 1863, provided particularly valuable details. "You ask if the rumors of an Indian woman fighting for our side are true. I can confirm that there is indeed such a person, though few have seen her directly. She operates as a scout and irregular fighter behind enemy lines, typically alone or with 1 or 2 companions. The Cherokee among our guides call her Running Deer, though whether this is her true name or a nom de guerre, I cannot say. What I know with certainty is that she has provided intelligence of extraordinary accuracy regarding Confederate movements, and that enemy soldiers found dead after her raids are invariably missing the index finger of their right hand, the trigger finger, in a grim symbolism that requires no explanation. Perhaps the most detailed account came from the military records of General Ambrose Burnside, who commanded Union forces in eastern Tennessee during 1863. A confidential report in his papers, discovered in the National Archives by the research team, outlined the recruitment and activities of special scouts drawn from local populations, including Native Americans familiar with the challenging mountain terrain. One passage, previously overlooked by historians, proved crucial. Among our most effective operatives is a Cherokee woman, approximately 30 years of age, who presents herself as Sarah Walkingstick. She claims to have lost her entire family during a Confederate raid on a settlement near the North Carolina border, suspected of harboring Unionist sympathizers. Her knowledge of the terrain is unparalleled, and her tracking skills have proven invaluable. Her methods are sometimes more severe than military protocol would dictate. But in the irregular warfare of this region, such excesses are difficult to prevent, and, in truth, have produced a fear among enemy forces that serves our strategic objectives. With this name, Sarah Walkingstick, the research team was able to trace the woman's background through Cherokee tribal records. She was born in 1835 near what is now Cherokee, North Carolina, to a mother from the Wolf clan and a father who had been among the small number of Cherokee who fought in the Seminole Wars in Florida. The family had evaded the forced removal of the Trail of Tears by retreating deep into the mountains, where they lived in a small community of other Cherokee who had similarly escaped federal troops. According to an oral history recorded by anthropologist James Mooney in the 1890s, Sarah had shown unusual aptitude for hunting and tracking from an early age, skills typically associated with male roles in Cherokee society. A tribal elder interviewed by Mooney recalled, "She could move through the forest like smoke, leaving no trace of her passing." Her father, who had learned warcraft fighting alongside white soldiers in Florida, taught her not just to hunt game, but to track human prey. Some thought it unnatural for a woman, but others said she carried the spirit of Tsiyu, the legendary warrior woman of ancient times. Sarah's transformation from mountain hunter to Union scout appears to have occurred in the spring of 1862, following an incident documented in both military reports and local newspaper accounts. Confederate forces, responding to reports of Unionist activity in eastern Tennessee, conducted a series of raids on isolated homesteads and small communities suspected of harboring Union sympathizers. One such raid targeted a small mixed settlement near the Tennessee-North Carolina border, where several Cherokee families, including Sarah's, lived alongside white settlers with Union leanings. The raid, conducted by irregular Confederate cavalry under the command of Captain William Davidson, was particularly brutal. Military discipline broke down, and what began as a search for Unionist sympathizers devolved into an indiscriminate attack. 23 civilians were killed, including Sarah's husband, parents, and 2 young children. A report filed by a Union officer who investigated the aftermath described the scene. The settlement was razed entirely, with all buildings burned to the ground. Bodies were found in positions indicating they had been slain while fleeing rather than resisting. Most disturbing were signs of deliberate cruelty, including evidence that some victims had been forced to witness the execution of family members before meeting their own end. Sarah was apparently absent during the attack, having gone into the mountains on a hunting expedition. Upon returning to find her family and community destroyed, she disappeared into the wilderness. Confederate reports from the following weeks describe a series of increasingly bold attacks on isolated Confederate positions and supply lines in the region, attacks characterized by precision, stealth, and the signature removal of the right index finger from each victim. By summer 1862, Union intelligence officers operating in the area had identified the person behind these attacks and recruited her into more formal service. While never officially enlisted, Native Americans would not be formally eligible for military service until later in the war, and women were officially excluded entirely. Sarah was issued a uniform, equipment, and operated under the loose command structure of Union intelligence services. She essentially functioned as what we would now call a special operations force, explained military historian Colonel Robert Whitehawk, retired. Her intimate knowledge of the terrain gave her advantages no conventional soldier could match, while her tracking skills and Cherokee hunting techniques made her nearly impossible to counter using standard military tactics. Most significantly, she understood psychological warfare in ways that went beyond conventional military thinking of the era. The psychological impact of Sarah's operations was documented in numerous Confederate sources. A report from Confederate Brigadier General John Pegram to his superiors in August 1863 noted, "Our forces in eastern Tennessee are facing not merely conventional opposition, but a form of irregular warfare for which they are poorly prepared. Soldiers speak of an Indian woman who strikes without warning and vanishes without trace, leaving behind mutilated bodies as grim calling cards." While rational men recognize this as merely effective guerrilla tactics, the psychological effect on troops operating in unfamiliar mountain terrain cannot be overstated. Some units refuse night operations entirely, and desertion rates have increased markedly. Third, what made Sarah particularly effective was her integration of traditional Cherokee spiritual practices into her warfare techniques. Among the artifacts found at the burial site were several small medicine bundles containing herbs traditional to Cherokee healing and spiritual practices, along with carved wooden symbols associated with the Wolf Clan, known in Cherokee tradition for their role as warriors and protectors. Dr. Rebecca Nighthawk, expert in Cherokee spiritual traditions at the University of North Carolina, explained the significance. The arrangement of the finger bones in a specific pattern around her body suggests she was engaging in what Cherokee would recognize as war medicine, spiritual practices intended not just to protect the warrior, but to project power over enemies. The blackening and preservation of the finger bones, combined with the naming tags, indicates a ritual purpose beyond mere trophy-taking. In Cherokee spiritual understanding, possessing a part of an enemy gave you continuing power over them, even after their death. This spiritual dimension adds a layer of complexity to understanding Sarah's actions. Rather than viewing the collection of fingers as merely gruesome war trophies, they can be understood as part of a spiritual practice intended to protect her people and territory from those she perceived as invaders, a framework that had deep roots in Cherokee cultural traditions predating European contact. It's important to understand that Sarah was operating within a dual cultural context, emphasized Dr. Talchief. She had adopted elements of Western warfare, as evidenced by her use of firearms and her service within Union command structures, but she integrated these with traditional Cherokee spiritual and martial practices. This wasn't primitive savagery, as some early commentators suggested when our findings were first published. It was a sophisticated cultural adaptation, using traditional spiritual frameworks to process and respond to the trauma of losing her family and community. The precise circumstances of Sarah's death remain uncertain. The condition of her remains indicated no obvious cause, such as battlefield injury. Analysis of bone and tissue samples, however, revealed elevated levels of lead and arsenic, suggesting possible poisoning. Whether deliberate or accidental remains impossible to determine with certainty. The hasty nature of her burial, combined with the careful arrangement of her collected trophies around her body, suggests that those who buried her were likely Cherokee themselves, or at least familiar with Cherokee practices. They took care to honor her warrior status, while ensuring her spiritual tools remained with her for the journey to the afterlife. Whoever buried her understood the significance of what she carried, noted Dr. Nighthawk. In Cherokee belief, if these ritual objects had been separated from her at death, her spirit might be unable to complete its journey, remaining bound to the earthly plane as a ghost, or uktina, dangerous spirit. The careful arrangement indicates a burial conducted with appropriate spiritual knowledge, even if circumstances required haste. Historical records provide some possible context for the timing and circumstances of her death. Union military correspondence from December 1863 mentions the loss of a valuable intelligence asset in eastern Tennessee, coinciding with a Confederate counteroffensive in the region. A letter from a Union officer to his brother, dated January 1864, offers more specific details. Our Cherokee scout, the woman who struck such fear into rebel hearts, was found dead at her camp last week. Circumstances suggest treachery rather than battle. Certain local elements, though professing Union loyalty, had grown uncomfortable with her methods and the attention they drew from Confederate forces. It would not surprise me to learn that her evening meal had been doctored by those ostensibly on our own side. This suggestion of poisoning by nominal allies aligns with the forensic evidence and adds a layer of tragic irony to Sarah's story. Having survived countless high-risk operations behind enemy lines, she may have ultimately fallen victim to the complex internal politics of a region where loyalties were rarely as clear-cut as military affiliations suggested. The burial site contained one final element that researchers found particularly significant: a modified 1860 Colt Army revolver with distinct adaptations. The weapon had been customized with Cherokee symbols carved into the grip, and the barrel had been shortened for easier concealment. Most notably, the trigger guard had been enlarged and reshaped to accommodate 2 fingers rather than 1, a modification that would allow the user to fire accurately using the middle finger after losing or injuring the index finger. This modification suggests something remarkable, explained firearms historian Dr. Thomas Blackhorse. It appears that Sarah had deliberately removed her own right index finger, mirroring what she did to her enemies. This act of ritual self-modification would have profound significance in Cherokee warrior traditions, symbolically taking on the power of her enemies by sharing in their sacrifice. It also served the practical purpose of demonstrating that she could continue to fight effectively despite missing the finger normally used for firing a weapon. This theory was confirmed by analysis of Sarah's skeletal remains, which showed that her right index finger had indeed been removed, with bone healing patterns indicating this had occurred months before her death. Unlike the clean cuts on her victims, however, her own finger appeared to have been removed through a more ceremonial process, with marks suggesting ritual preparation of the amputation site. This self-amputation would have represented a profound spiritual commitment, Dr. Nighthawk explained. In Cherokee tradition, voluntary physical sacrifice demonstrated dedication to one's spiritual path and purpose. By removing the same finger she took from her enemies, she was creating a powerful spiritual connection, essentially stating that she was willing to bear the same mark she inflicted, binding her fate to theirs in the spiritual realm. The discovery of Sarah Walkingstick's burial site has forced historians to reconsider several aspects of Civil War history, particularly regarding the role of women and Native Americans in the conflict. While approximately 400 women are known to have disguised themselves as men to fight for both Union and Confederate forces, Sarah's case is unique in that she served openly as a woman, leveraging her gender rather than hiding it. Confederate soldiers were conditioned to look for male threats, explained Dr. Patricia Strongbow, historian of women in warfare. A Cherokee woman could move through checkpoints or near encampments while raising far fewer suspicions than a male scout would have. Rather than a limitation, her gender became a strategic advantage in intelligence gathering. Similarly, while Native American participation in the Civil War has been increasingly acknowledged by historians in recent decades, the integration of traditional indigenous warfare practices within the structure of Western military conflict has received less attention. Sarah's case demonstrates how some Native American participants brought not just their physical skills, but their cultural and spiritual frameworks into their service, fighting a war that was, from their perspective, as much about tribal survival as about Union or Confederate causes. Sarah Walkingstick represents a form of cultural resistance that goes beyond simply choosing a side in the white man's war. noted Dr. Runningwolf. She adapted the conflict to her own cultural framework, fighting not primarily for abstract notions of union or secession, but for the concrete protection of her people and territory, using methods that maintained Cherokee spiritual and martial traditions even while operating within Western military structures. The archaeological team made another discovery that shed light on a particularly mysterious aspect of Sarah's operations. Among the items buried with her was a small leather-bound journal, its pages largely degraded, but with portions still legible after careful conservation efforts. The journal, written primarily in the Cherokee syllabary developed by Sequoyah in the early 19th century, with occasional entries in English, appeared to be Sarah's personal record of her activities. Dr. Rebecca Yellowhawk, a Cherokee linguist who worked on translating the recovered text, described its contents. The journal reveals that Sarah was not working entirely alone, as most historical accounts had suggested. She was part of a small network of Cherokee women who had lost family members to Confederate actions and had banded together in response. The group never numbered more than 5 or 6 individuals, but they coordinated their activities across a substantial territory, creating the impression of a much larger force. One partially preserved entry, dated August 1863, provided crucial insight into the group's methods. We move like ghosts through their camps. Elizabeth takes their maps, while Mary counts their supplies. I study the officers, learning their faces for when we meet again. They see only Indian women, invisible as trees or rocks to their eyes. Their blindness is our strength. This entry reveals the sophisticated intelligence gathering that preceded the more dramatic aspects of their operations. Sarah and her companions apparently exploited racial and gender prejudices that rendered Native American women effectively invisible to white soldiers, allowing them to move through Confederate territory, gathering critical information before conducting targeted strikes. This challenges the narrative that Sarah was simply a vengeful fighter conducting terror raids, explained Dr. Telchief. Her operations were far more strategic. The journal indicates detailed reconnaissance, careful target selection, and coordination with conventional Union forces. She wasn't just killing Confederate soldiers at random. She was systematically eliminating key personnel, disrupting supply lines, and collecting intelligence that proved valuable for larger Union operations in the region. The most disturbing entries in the journal concerned the ritual removal of fingers from her victims. One partially legible passage offered insight into the spiritual framework behind this practice. Each finger carries their spirit's power. As the moon grows full, I place them in the sacred circle, speaking their names to the ancestors. Their strength flows into our people, returning what was taken from us. This is not the white man's war medicine, but the old way, the true way. Thief. This passage suggests that Sarah viewed her actions not merely as combat tactics, but as spiritual warfare conducted according to Cherokee traditions. The collection of fingers was part of a ritual process intended to harness the strength of defeated enemies and redirect it toward the protection of her community, a concept with deep roots in traditional Cherokee spiritual practices. Dr. Nighthawk explained, in Cherokee cosmology, power could be transferred from one being to another. By taking the trigger finger, the source of an enemy's ability to inflict harm, and subjecting it to ritual treatment, Sarah was essentially capturing and redirecting that harmful power. From a Western perspective, this might seem barbaric, but within her cultural framework, it was a sophisticated spiritual technology for protecting her people. The journal also revealed another dimension of Sarah's story that had been entirely absent from historical records: her role as a healer as well as a fighter. Several entries described using traditional Cherokee plant medicines to treat injured Union soldiers, civilian refugees, and even, in one poignant passage, a wounded Confederate soldier who had been abandoned by his retreating unit. Found the boy soldier by the creek. she wrote in an entry from October 1863. No more than 16 summers, shot through the shoulder and burning with fever. He wears the gray coat, but his eyes hold no hatred. I made the white oak bark tea and packed the wound with spiderweb and chickweed, left him with water and cornmeal. The killing hand must also know healing. This is balance. This commitment to healing alongside warfare reflects the Cherokee concept of balance that was central to their worldview, rather than seeing combat and healing as separate or contradictory activities. Traditional Cherokee culture viewed them as complementary aspects of protecting and sustaining the community. Sarah wasn't simply a killer, emphasized Dr. Running Wolf. The journal reveals a woman deeply committed to Cherokee concepts of balance and spiritual harmony, even while engaging in warfare. She understood her role as both destroyer and preserver, bringing death to enemies, but also life and healing to her community, and even, when circumstances warranted, to wounded enemies who no longer posed a threat. Perhaps the most significant revelation from the journal came from entries describing Sarah's ultimate purpose. While her initial motivation clearly stemmed from avenging her family, her vision expanded over time to encompass the broader survival of Cherokee culture and people. A particularly striking entry from November 1863 read, "The white men fight for union or secession, words that mean nothing to our people. I fight for what remains of Cherokee land and life. When their war ends, whichever side claims victory will turn their eyes west to our mountains once again. I take these fingers and make this medicine not just to win their war, but to prepare for what comes after, to make them remember fear when they look to our hills." This passage suggests that Sarah viewed her participation in the Civil War as merely one chapter in a longer struggle for Cherokee survival, a perspective that proved tragically prescient. Following the Union victory in 1865, pressure on the remaining Cherokee lands in North Carolina and Tennessee intensified as Reconstruction brought new waves of settlement and development to the region. The journal's final legible entry, dated November 18, 1863, just weeks before Sarah's presumed death, contained a passage that researchers found particularly moving. "I dreamed of my children last night, standing by the river where we used to gather fish in spring. They asked when I would join them in the nightland. Soon, I told them. The medicine shows me that my path grows short. I have taken 37 fingers, and with them made a shield of fear around our mountains. When I am gone, the others will continue. The Cherokee have faced death before and remained. We will remain again." This entry not only foreshadowed her own death, but revealed her belief that her actions had created a lasting protective influence around Cherokee territories, a spiritual barrier that would continue to operate after her physical passing. In the century and a half since Sarah Walking Stick's death, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians has maintained their presence in the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee, preserving their culture and language despite continuing pressures. Whether through coincidence or more mysterious workings, the regions where Sarah operated most actively remained among the areas where Cherokee presence and land ownership proved most resilient in the decades following the Civil War. The discovery of Sarah's burial site and the subsequent research has prompted significant reconsideration of how historians understand both Native American involvement in the Civil War and the broader question of indigenous resistance to colonization. Rather than seeing Native Americans as passive victims or minor participants in larger historical processes, Sarah's story reveals sophisticated strategic adaptation, using the conflicts of the colonizing culture as opportunities to advance indigenous survival. Dr. Running Wolf explained, "What makes Sarah's story so significant is how it demonstrates indigenous agency and strategic thinking. She wasn't simply reacting to events or being swept up in the white man's war. She was deliberately leveraging the conflict to create space for Cherokee survival. using methods that maintained cultural continuity while adapting to changing circumstances. The artifacts from Sarah's burial, the modified uniform, the customized weapon, the ritual objects, and especially the preserved fingers of her enemies, have raised complex questions about their appropriate treatment and display. After extensive consultation with Cherokee tribal authorities, most items have been reburied in a private ceremony, with only non-human remains retained for research and limited educational display. These aren't simply historical artifacts, noted Cherokee Nation Principal Chief Charles Blackfox during the reburial ceremony in 2019. They are sacred objects imbued with spiritual power and human remains that demand respectful treatment according to Cherokee traditions. Sarah Walkingstick fought to protect our people and culture. We continue that fight by ensuring her spiritual tools and the remains of those connected to her are treated with appropriate reverence. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians has incorporated Sarah's story into their cultural heritage programs, presenting her not as a simplistic figure of vengeance, but as a complex defender who operated within traditional Cherokee spiritual and ethical frameworks while adapting to the realities of 19th-century warfare. Sarah Walkingstick represents what anthropologists call indigenization, the process by which Native peoples adapted foreign elements into their own cultural frameworks rather than simply assimilating, explained Dr. Tallchief. She wore a Union uniform but transformed it with Cherokee symbols and practices. She used Western firearms but modified them according to Cherokee spiritual principles. She engaged with the Civil War but reframed it as part of the longer struggle for Cherokee sovereignty and survival. This process of indigenization offers important insights for understanding how Native American cultures have maintained continuity despite centuries of colonization and forced assimilation. Rather than simply rejecting all aspects of European American culture or passively accepting them, indigenous communities like the Cherokee actively transformed and incorporated selected elements into their own cultural systems, maintaining core values and practices while adapting to changing circumstances. Sarah's story also challenges conventional narratives about gender in both Native American and European American contexts. While Cherokee society traditionally offered women more autonomy and political voice than European American society of the same period, female warriors remained exceptional. Sarah appears to have navigated between these cultural expectations, leveraging traditional Cherokee respect for women's power while expanding the boundaries of conventional gender roles. She wasn't just transgressing white gender norms by fighting as a woman, noted Dr. Strongbow. She was also pushing the boundaries of traditional Cherokee gender roles, though in ways that connected to deeper Cherokee traditions about women's power and spiritual authority. The journal suggests she understood herself not as violating Cherokee traditions, but as drawing on older, sometimes dormant aspects of those traditions to meet extraordinary circumstances. The DNA analysis of Sarah's remains provided an additional dimension to her story. Along with confirming her Cherokee ancestry, it revealed European genetic markers consistent with having at least one grandparent of Scottish or Irish descent, a common pattern among Cherokee in the 19th century, following generations of trade, intermarriage, and cultural exchange with European settlers. This mixed ancestry doesn't make her less Cherokee, as some early critics of our findings suggested, emphasized Dr. Running Wolf. It makes her representative of the actual lived reality of most Cherokee people by the 19th century. Indigenous identity has never been about genetic purity, but about cultural connection, community belonging, and shared values and practices. In this sense, Sarah Walkingstick embodied the complex reality of Native American identity in a colonial context, maintaining fierce commitment to Cherokee culture and sovereignty while physically embodying the history of contact and exchange between indigenous and European populations. Her story defies simplistic categorizations, revealing instead the nuanced ways actual individuals navigated between cultural worlds. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of Sarah's story is how it has resonated with contemporary Cherokee people, particularly women. Since the public announcement of the archaeological findings in 2018, Cherokee women veterans have held annual ceremonies honoring Sarah's memory and connecting her story to their own service in American military forces. Mary Blackfeather, a Cherokee veteran who served in Afghanistan, explained the significance. Sarah Walkingstick shows us that Cherokee women have always been warriors when our people needed protection. She fought using both the weapons of the enemy and the spiritual practices of our ancestors. Today, we continue that tradition, serving in the U.S. military while maintaining our Cherokee identity and values. Her story reminds us that we aren't abandoning our culture by serving. We're continuing a tradition of Cherokee adaptation and resilience that goes back centuries. This contemporary resonance underscores perhaps the most important aspect of Sarah's story. It isn't simply a historical curiosity, but a living legacy that continues to inform how Cherokee people, particularly women, understand their place in both Cherokee tradition and American society. As archaeological research at the site continues, with additional areas still being carefully excavated, historians and archaeologists remain open to the possibility of discovering more about Sarah and her network of Cherokee women fighters. Ground-penetrating radar has identified several anomalies in the surrounding area that may represent additional burials or caches of supplies and weapons. We've only begun to uncover this chapter of history, noted Dr. Running Wolf. The traditional historical narrative of the Civil War has focused overwhelmingly on the experiences and actions of white men on both sides. Stories like Sarah's remind us how many other participants, women, Native Americans, African Americans, shaped the conflict in ways that have remained largely invisible in conventional histories. As we conclude this extraordinary journey through a hidden chapter of American history, we're left with a story far more complex and provocative than most Civil War narratives. Sarah Walkingstick was neither a perfect hero nor a simple villain. She was a woman responding to traumatic loss and existential threat with the cultural tools and spiritual frameworks available to her. Her methods may disturb modern sensibilities, but they reflected both the brutal realities of her time and the deep spiritual traditions of her people. For those who believe, there may be another dimension to consider in Sarah's story. Throughout Scripture, we see how God often works through unlikely instruments to achieve protection for vulnerable communities. From Deborah leading Israel into battle to Jael driving a tent peg through an enemy commander's head, biblical history is filled with women who took up the mantle of warrior when circumstances demanded. Like them, Sarah Walkingstick stood in defense of her people when conventional protections had failed, guided by spiritual convictions that gave meaning and purpose to her actions. The finger bones buried with Sarah Walkingstick, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this archaeological discovery, remind us that history in its unvarnished reality is often more challenging than the sanitized versions presented in textbooks. They represent a spiritual practice alien to modern Western sensibilities, but deeply meaningful within the cultural context that produced it. They challenge us to stretch our understanding beyond comfortable assumptions about how humans have made meaning of violence, death, and survival throughout history. The next time you drive through the misty mountains of eastern Tennessee or western North Carolina, consider that beneath that spectacular beauty lies a complex history of conflict, resistance, and survival. The peaceful hills that now draw tourists and nature enthusiasts once witnessed a woman warrior's desperate fight to protect what remained of her people and culture. A fight conducted with both physical weapons and spiritual power, according to traditions far older than the nation that now claims those territories. Sarah Walkingstick's finger collection may have shocked modern historians, But perhaps what should shock us more is how readily we forget the desperation of those fighting not for abstract political principles, but for the very survival of their communities and ways of life. Her story compels us to reconsider not just the Civil War, but the entire process of American nation-building, from the perspective of those who fought to maintain their sovereignty and cultural identity amid overwhelming pressure. In that reconsideration lies the possibility not just of a more complete understanding of our shared past, but of greater wisdom as we face the ongoing challenges of building a society that respects the diverse traditions and experiences that have shaped our common history. Perhaps, like the finger bones preserved through Sarah's spiritual practices, certain essential truths about our national story have been preserved underground, waiting for the right moment to be revealed, challenging us to see our history through different eyes and to acknowledge the complex humanity of those who came before us. Have you ever wondered what secrets lie buried in the personal records of those who fought our most controversial wars? What if I told you that one man's journal, written by a Navajo sniper who served in the darkest corners of Vietnam, contained revelations so profound they left hardened combat veterans speechless? Before I reveal the extraordinary contents of this long-hidden document, take a moment to comment where you're from and subscribe to our channel. We need your support to continue bringing these hidden chapters of American military history to light. The year was 1971. As the Vietnam War continued its bloody course and anti-war protests raged across America, a young Navajo soldier named Thomas Begay returned home to the reservation near Chinle, Arizona. He carried with him little more than his duffel bag, a Purple Heart medal that he kept wrapped in cloth rather than displayed, and a weathered leather journal filled with handwritten entries in both English and Navajo. Like many returning Vietnam veterans, Begay found reintegration into civilian life challenging. He spoke little about his experiences, even to close family members. His mother, Sarah Begay, would later recall, "When Thomas came home, it was like only his body returned. Something in his spirit remained in that distant place. He would sit for hours, staring at the mesas, writing in his journal, but never speaking of what he had seen or done." What nobody knew then, what wouldn't be discovered for nearly 50 years, was that Thomas Begay's journal contained accounts that would eventually challenge official military narratives and reveal operational details that senior military officials had deliberately kept from the American public. Begay had served in a specialized reconnaissance unit with the designation SOG Prairie Fire, operating primarily in the border regions where Vietnam met Laos and Cambodia. As a sniper with exceptional skills, he was frequently assigned to missions that officially never happened, in places where American troops were never present. After returning home, Begay lived quietly on the reservation, working occasionally as a guide for tourists and spending long periods in solitude. In 1984, at the age of 36, he died in a single-vehicle accident on a remote reservation road. His personal effects, including his journal, passed to his younger sister, Marie Begay. "Thomas asked me to keep his writings safe," Marie explained in a recent interview. "He told me that someday, when the time was right, people would need to know what was in them. But he didn't want them revealed while certain people were still alive and in positions of power." Marie honored her brother's request. For decades, the journal remained stored in a cedar box in her home, its contents known only to her. It might have remained there indefinitely if not for a chance encounter in 2017 between Marie and Dr. Robert Blackhorse, a Navajo historian researching the experiences of indigenous soldiers in Vietnam. "I was conducting interviews on the reservation for an oral history project," Dr. Blackhorse recalls. Marie mentioned her brother had been a sniper in Vietnam and had kept detailed journals. Given how few written first-hand accounts exist from Native American soldiers in that conflict, I asked if she would consider allowing me to review them for my research. After careful consideration, Marie decided the time had come to honor her brother's wish that his story eventually be told. She entrusted the journal to Dr. Blackhorse, who quickly recognized he had encountered a document of extraordinary historical significance. From the first pages, it was clear this was unlike any Vietnam War account I had ever read, Dr. Blackhorse explains. Thomas had documented operations that officially never existed, in locations where American troops were never supposed to be. But what made the journal truly remarkable was the second narrative interwoven with his combat experiences. His spiritual journey as a Navajo warrior carrying ancient traditions into modern warfare. The journal began conventionally enough, with Begay's entry upon arriving in Vietnam in February 1969. He described the oppressive heat, the unfamiliar terrain, and his initial assignments. But by April, after his transfer to the Specialized Reconnaissance Unit, the entries took on a different character. April 12, 1969. Today I was informed of my new assignment, Begay wrote. They selected me because of my marksmanship scores, and because, as they put it, Navajos know how to move through terrain without being detected. See, little do they realize this skill comes not from being Navajo specifically, but from the teachings my grandfather passed to me, how to see the world as interconnected, how to become part of the landscape rather than an intruder upon it. The journal detailed Begay's specialized training and his gradual integration into highly classified operations. He wrote about being approached by senior officers who were interested in his cultural background. May 3, 1969. Captain Reynolds questioned me about Navajo beliefs regarding taking another human life. I explained that traditional Navajo ways see killing as creating dangerous spiritual imbalance, that it requires extensive ceremonial cleansing. He nodded as though understanding, but then asked if I could teach other snipers to think like an Indian. I remained silent. How could I explain that this is not a technique to be learned in days, but a worldview cultivated over a lifetime? They want me to kill with precision, but don't understand that each death creates ripples in the harmony of all things. As Begay's deployment progressed, his entries documented increasingly classified operations. He described being flown by unmarked helicopters into Laos and Cambodia, countries where the United States officially had no ground troops. These missions, conducted under the code name Prairie Fire, involved small teams inserting deep into enemy territory to gather intelligence or eliminate specific targets. July 18, 1969. Third mission into the area they call Base Area 609. We aren't supposed to know we're in Cambodia, just as no one back home is supposed to know we're fighting a war here. I am now keeping count in two ways: the official count of confirmed targets that I report to command, and the true count that I mark in Navajo symbols. Each one requires a ceremony I can only conduct in my mind, storing the need for cleansing like a debt that grows with each shot. Most significant were Begay's accounts of operations targeting not just North Vietnamese or Viet Cong fighters, but individuals identified as Soviet advisors, and, most controversially, Chinese military observers. These references suggested a level of direct involvement by America's Cold War adversaries that exceeded what had been publicly acknowledged. August 23, 1969. Today's mission briefing identified the target as a high-value military advisor from Russia. We were shown photographs and told this individual was providing advanced training to anti-aircraft units. I asked Captain Reynolds directly if we were now targeting Russians. He corrected me immediately. There are no Russians in Vietnam, officially. There are no Americans in Cambodia, officially. This conversation never happened, officially. As Dr. Blackhorse studied the journal, he consulted with military historians specializing in the Vietnam conflict. The consensus was clear. If authenticated, Begay's accounts would provide previously undocumented evidence of operations that had been deliberately concealed not just from the American public, but from congressional oversight. Dr. William Thompson, a historian at the Naval War College who reviewed the journal, noted, "What makes Begay's account particularly valuable is its contemporaneous nature. This isn't a memoir written decades later with the benefit of hindsight, or influenced by others' accounts. These are real-time observations written by someone with no apparent political agenda, simply documenting his experiences as they occurred." The journal's authentication process was rigorous. Handwriting analysis confirmed consistency with Begay's known writing samples. References to weather conditions matched meteorological records from the regions and dates mentioned. Names of fellow soldiers were cross-referenced with unit rosters. The journal's physical properties, the paper, ink, and binding, were all consistent with materials available during the time period. But perhaps the most compelling evidence of authenticity came from Begay's detailed descriptions of the terrain, flora, and fauna of specific locations in Laos and Cambodia, details that would have been unknown to anyone who hadn't physically been present in those regions during that period. Beyond its military and historical significance, the journal offered profound insights into the spiritual and psychological experience of an indigenous soldier bringing ancient traditions into modern warfare. Throughout his accounts of combat operations, Begay maintained a parallel narrative of his spiritual journey. October 5, 1969, I surpassed 50 confirmed eliminations today. The captain celebrated, but doesn't understand what this number means to me. In the old days, a Navajo who had taken an enemy life would undergo elaborate purification ceremonies, living separately from the tribe until the danger of the disharmony had passed. Here, I'm expected to take life in the morning and eat dinner with the same hands at night. I've developed my own ceremonies, small prayers and rituals I can perform without drawing attention. I don't know if they're sufficient, but they're all I have to prevent the chindi, harmful spirits of the dead, from following me home. Begay's entries revealed how he incorporated traditional Navajo spiritual practices into his role as a sniper. He described creating small, discreet offerings before missions. He wrote about visualizing the Beauty Way ceremonies while waiting motionless for hours in concealment. He documented how he would whisper traditional prayers in Navajo at the moment he squeezed the trigger. December 12, 1969. The others marvel at my patience. Reynolds said today, "Begay can outweight the mountains themselves. They don't understand that I was taught to see time differently." Grandfather showed me how the mesas and canyons of our homeland teach us that waiting is not empty time, but full connection. When I'm in position for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours without moving, I'm not fighting impatience as they do. I'm in Hojo, in harmony, balanced between earth and sky, past and future, life and death. As his tour of duty progressed, Begay's entries reflected growing inner conflict. He remained committed to protecting his fellow soldiers and executing his missions with precision, but he increasingly questioned the larger purpose of the war and worried about the spiritual price he was paying. February 27, 1970. Last night I dreamed I was home, walking near Black Mesa, but the landscape transformed into the Vietnamese highlands. The juniper trees became jungle vines. The red rocks turned to mud. Grandfather appeared and asked, "Who are you becoming in this place?" I couldn't answer. Today I eliminated a target who couldn't have been more than 17, younger than my brother Michael. As I watched through the scope, for a moment before I fired, I wondered the same thing. Who am I becoming? Perhaps the most controversial sections of the journal detailed operations that targeted not military installations or personnel, but infrastructure used by civilians. Begay documented missions to eliminate individuals identified as tax collectors, village administrators, and propaganda officers, civilians whose deaths would disrupt the functioning of local governance systems. April 18, 1970. Today's briefing described a new strategic objective: systematically removing the shadow government in regions that officially remain under Saigon's control. We're no longer just targeting those carrying weapons, but those carrying ledgers, conducting local elections, or teaching in certain villages. Reynolds explains this as cutting off the political head of the insurgency. I understand the military logic, but cannot reconcile it with what I was taught about honorable combat. These entries align with what historians now understand about the controversial Phoenix program, a CIA-led initiative that targeted the civilian infrastructure of the Viet Cong. Begay's first-hand accounts provide new insights into how these operations were executed on the ground and the moral complexities faced by those tasked with carrying them out. By mid-1970, Begay's entries show increasing disillusionment, not with his immediate team or mission, but with the larger purpose and direction of the war. He questioned decisions made by commanders far removed from the realities of the conflict and worried about the long-term consequences of America's actions in Southeast Asia. June 8, 1970. We eliminated 3 targets today identified as Chinese military observers. Reynolds was explicit. This operation never happened. No report will show Chinese casualties by American hands. No one at home will know how close this proxy war comes to direct confrontation between superpowers. We operate in shadows so deep that truth itself seems lost. I wonder if there will ever be a complete accounting of what is being done here, or if these actions will disappear like footprints in the desert after a storm. As his deployment neared its end, Begay's entries reflected his concerns about returning home. He worried about bringing the spiritual disharmony of combat back to his community, and whether he could successfully reintegrate into civilian life. October 30th, 1970. Final confirmed count stands at 94. Nearly 100 souls I must account for in the next life. Captain Reynolds recommended me for Distinguished Service Cross, but the operation locations make this impossible without revealing where we've been. I'll receive a lesser medal instead, with a citation that obscures more than it reveals. Perhaps that's fitting. A partial acknowledgement for actions half in shadow. 2 weeks until I return home, though I don't know who it is that's returning. Begay's final entries before leaving Vietnam reflected both his pride in having protected his fellow soldiers and deep uncertainty about the war's purpose and his role in it. November 12, 1970. Last entry from this place. Tomorrow we depart for processing out. Reynolds told me I saved countless American lives through my service, his preferred word for killing. I believe this is true, and there is honor in protecting one's brothers in arms. But I cannot stop asking, what were we really doing here? The official reasons change like shifting sand. We are told we fight for freedom, for democracy, against communism, for the South Vietnamese people. But from my hidden positions, watching through my scope, I've seen a reality more complex than any briefing ever acknowledged. Upon his return to the United States, Begay continued his journal, documenting his difficult transition to civilian life. His entries described nightmares, hypervigilance, and the challenges of explaining his experiences to family members who couldn't comprehend what he had endured. Experiences that weren't captured in newspapers or television reports about the war. December 25, 1970. First Christmas back. Family gathered at Mother's house. Uncle Ben asked about Vietnam, expecting heroic stories. How could I explain missions that officially never happened? Places we never officially were? When I tried to speak truthfully about ambiguity and moral complexity, he changed the subject, disappointed. They want either uncomplicated heroism or simple condemnation. The truth lives in a middle ground no one seems comfortable occupying. The journal's final entries, written in the months before Begay's death in 1984, revealed his ongoing struggle with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as his efforts to find healing through traditional Navajo ceremonies. March 18, 1984. Participated in the Enemy Way ceremony again yesterday. The medicine man says the cleansing is working, that the chindi are gradually being released. I want to believe him. Some nights are better now. But how does one measure healing from wounds that leave no visible scars? I still see their faces in dreams, not just those I eliminated, but those we were never officially there to protect, whose villages burned while politicians spoke of winning hearts and minds. When Dr. Blackhorse completed his analysis of the journal, he understood its explosive potential. Here was a first-hand account that contradicted official narratives, documented classified operations, and revealed a level of involvement by Soviet and Chinese personnel that exceeded public acknowledgments. Beyond that, it offered unique insights into the psychological and spiritual experience of combat from an indigenous perspective rarely represented in Vietnam War literature. After consultation with Marie Biguet, Dr. Blackhorse approached the Vietnam Veterans of America organization with the journal. A special committee of senior veterans, military historians, and intelligence specialists was assembled to review the document. Colonel James Rainwater, Retembert, who served in special operations in Vietnam and participated in the review, recalls the profound impact of Biguet's writings. Reading his account was like having a missing puzzle piece suddenly reveal the true picture of operations we were part of, but never fully understood. Many of us had fragments of this knowledge. We knew about certain missions that were never officially acknowledged, but Biguet's journal connected these fragments into a coherent whole, and he wrote with a clarity and spiritual depth that left many of us, hardened combat veterans, sitting in silence after reading it. The Veterans Organization faced a difficult decision. The journal contained information that, technically, remained classified. Publishing it could potentially violate security regulations even decades later. Yet it also represented an important historical document that could contribute to a more complete understanding of the Vietnam War. After lengthy deliberation, the organization approached the Department of Defense with the journal, initiating a process of selective declassification review. This process, completed in 2019, resulted in approximately 85% of the journal being cleared for public release, with certain operational details and names of foreign nationals still redacted. The impact of the journal's release has been significant within military, historical, and Native American communities. For military historians, it has provided new evidence of the scope and nature of classified operations in Laos and Cambodia, as well as more direct involvement by Soviet and Chinese personnel than had been previously documented. For the Native American community, particularly the Navajo Nation, the journal has become an important cultural document, a window into how traditional spiritual practices were adapted to the most technologically advanced warfare of the time, and a poignant account of a warrior striving to maintain cultural identity and spiritual balance in circumstances far removed from traditional contexts. And for Vietnam veterans, particularly those who served in special operations, Biguet's writings have provided validation of experiences many had never been able to speak about openly. His articulation of the moral ambiguities and psychological challenges they faced has given voice to aspects of the Vietnam experience that remain difficult to communicate to those who weren't there. Dr. Blackhorse, 8 Suis, Ifrada der Filtroids, reflecting on the journal's significance, observes, "What makes Thomas Biguet's account so valuable is that he wrote from multiple perspectives simultaneously. As a highly trained American soldier, as a Navajo carrying ancient traditions, as an individual human being caught in the machinery of geopolitical conflict, he saw the war with remarkable clarity, precisely because he viewed it through these different lenses. His journal stands as both important historical documentation and profound spiritual testimony." The journal's publication in 2020, under the title Between Worlds, The War Journal of Thomas Biguet, created immediate ripples across military, academic, and indigenous communities. Within weeks, it had become required reading in courses on military history, Native American studies, and the Vietnam War at universities across the country. What made Begay's account so compelling was not just its revelations about classified operations, but the unique spiritual and psychological perspective it offered. Unlike most Vietnam memoirs written by non-indigenous soldiers, Begay's journal approached warfare through a distinctly Navajo worldview, one that viewed killing not just as a tactical necessity, but as a profound disruption of universal harmony, requiring ceremonial restoration. Dr. Sarah Whitehorse, professor of Indigenous Studies at Arizona State University, explains, Begay's journal represents a rare confluence of traditional indigenous spiritual framework with modern warfare. He brought a cosmology thousands of years old to bear on the most technologically advanced conflict of his time. The result is an account that transcends typical war narratives by embedding military action within a complex moral and spiritual universe. This spiritual dimension is particularly evident in entries where Begay described developing his own abbreviated ceremonial practices to maintain spiritual balance in the field. Unable to perform full traditional cleansing ceremonies after taking lives, he created modified rituals that could be conducted discreetly without compromising his operational security. August 8, 1970. Reynolds noticed me drawing small symbols in the dirt before missions and asked if it was some kind of Indian good luck charm. How could I explain that I am creating a miniature sand painting, a healing mandala that in proper form would cover an entire Hogan floor and involve days of ceremony? These abbreviated gestures feel insufficient, yet necessary, like trying to contain the vastness of the canyon in a handful of sand. But that handful is all I have. For many Navajo readers, these passages resonated deeply, revealing how traditional practices could be adapted and maintained even in seemingly incompatible circumstances. For non-native readers, they offered insight into a fundamentally different approach to warfare, one that acknowledged killing as sometimes necessary while recognizing it as spiritually dangerous and requiring ceremonial repair. Beyond its cultural significance, Begay's journal contained military information that forced reassessment of certain aspects of the Vietnam conflict. His detailed accounts of encounters with Soviet and Chinese personnel in advisory roles exceeded what had been officially acknowledged about the direct involvement of these Cold War powers. September 14, 1970. Eliminated target identified as senior Chinese military advisor at coordinates that would place us 10 kilometers inside Laos. The briefing indicated he was providing tactical training on a new anti-aircraft system. 3 weeks ago, it was a Russian providing similar guidance. The great powers play their chess game while presenting a fiction to the world that this is merely a civil war with modest foreign support. The pieces on the board, Vietnamese, Laotian, Cambodian, American, fall while the real players remain safely distant. These entries aligned with what some historians had long suspected but couldn't conclusively prove, that Soviet and Chinese military personnel were more directly involved in combat operations than publicly acknowledged, and that American forces specifically targeted these advisors in classified operations. Professor William Richardson, a military historian specializing in the Cold War period, notes, Begay's accounts provide some of the most specific documentation we have of direct Soviet and Chinese military advisory roles in theater. His position as a sniper targeting high-value individuals gave him a unique vantage point on aspects of the conflict that regular infantry units wouldn't have encountered. Horse, perhaps the most controversial sections of the journal, detailed operations that targeted civilian infrastructure under the Phoenix program. The systematic elimination of individuals identified as part of the Viet Cong's political and support network. Begay documented missions targeting village leaders, tax collectors, teachers, and medical personnel suspected of Viet Cong affiliation. May 27, 1970. Today's target was a schoolteacher in a village near the Cambodian border. Intelligence indicated he was using his position to recruit young men for the Viet Cong and provide information on American troop movements. As I watched him through the scope, he was writing on a chalkboard, teaching children. I completed the mission as ordered, but something in me broke at that moment. The line between combatant and civilian has become so blurred as to nearly disappear. These passages have reignited debate about the nature and ethics of the Phoenix program, which critics have characterized as an assassination campaign against civilians, while defenders maintain it was a legitimate effort to combat an insurgency that deliberately embedded itself within civilian populations. Colonel Raymond Thomas, Retter, who served as an intelligence officer during Vietnam and reviewed Begay's journal, offers this perspective. What Begay captures is the moral ambiguity that defined this conflict. The enemies didn't wear uniforms or observe conventional distinctions between civilian and military roles. His account doesn't resolve the ethical questions, but illuminates why they were so difficult, and continue to be difficult in similar conflicts today. The journal also documented the psychological toll of serving as a sniper, the unique burden of killing not in the chaos of direct combat, but through calculated, long-distance observation. Begay described watching targets through his scope for hours, observing their human moments before taking their lives. July 3, 1970. Observed today's target for 4 hours before conditions allowed for clean elimination. He ate lunch, spoke with colleagues, even stepped away once to pick a flower that he examined carefully before returning inside. These intimate moments of strangers' lives are a sniper's unusual burden to witness. The distance of the shot does not create emotional distance. If anything, the prolonged observation forces recognition of the target's humanity in ways direct combat might not. For veterans who had served as snipers in Vietnam and subsequent conflicts, these reflections provided validation of experiences many had never articulated. Several reached out to Dr. Blackhorse after the journal's publication, expressing how Begay had put into words the particular psychological weight they had carried since their service. Former Marine sniper David Mitchell, who served in Vietnam from 1968 to 1969, shared, "Reading Begay's journal was like finding words for something I'd felt but never expressed for 50 years. That strange intimacy with someone you're about to kill, the weight of observing their last normal moments, he captured it perfectly. His spiritual framework gave him a way to process this that many of us lacked." As word of the journal spread among Vietnam veterans, particularly those who had served in special operations, reunions and veterans gatherings became occasions for finally discussing experiences many had kept silent about for decades. Missions that never happened in places they never went could at last be acknowledged, at least among those who shared similar experiences. Colonel James Rainwater describes one such gathering. "We had a small reunion of Prairie Fire veterans after the journal was published. Men who hadn't said more than 'I served' for 50 years were finally talking about operations in Laos and Cambodia. One veteran in his 70s broke down saying, 'I thought I'd die with these stories untold.' Begay's journal gave them permission to acknowledge their own experiences. Mort, this breaking of silence extended to discussions of moral injury and post-traumatic stress. Begay's honest wrestling with the spiritual and psychological consequences of his actions provided a framework for veterans to examine their own unresolved trauma. His indigenous perspective offered an alternative to the often binary American discourse about Vietnam that cast veterans as either unambiguous heroes or unwitting villains. Dr. Michael Blackwolf, a Lakota psychologist specializing in trauma treatment for indigenous veterans, explains, "Begay's journal offers a healing middle path between glorification and condemnation of Vietnam service. His Navajo framework acknowledged both the necessity of certain actions in warfare and the spiritual damage they cause. This balanced perspective has been therapeutic for many veterans who found conventional narratives about Vietnam inadequate to their experience. For the Navajo Nation, the journal has become an important cultural document, one that demonstrates how traditional spiritual practices could be maintained and adapted even in the most challenging circumstances. It has been incorporated into educational programs about Navajo military service, which has long been a significant tradition from the code talkers of World War II to the present day. Andrew Tsosi, a Navajo cultural specialist who has developed educational materials based on the journal, explains, "What makes Begay's account so valuable for our young people is that it shows the persistence of Navajo spiritual values, even in circumstances far removed from traditional contexts. He found ways to maintain hojo, harmony, and balance, while performing duties that threatened that very balance. This teaches an important lesson about cultural adaptability and persistence." The journal has also prompted broader discussions about the role of indigenous spiritual and philosophical frameworks in helping all veterans process combat experiences. Traditional Native American approaches to warfare often included specific ceremonies for warriors returning from battle, rituals designed to cleanse spiritual contamination, reintegrate fighters into peaceful society, and restore harmony disrupted by violence. Some veterans organizations and even certain military units have begun exploring how these indigenous practices might inform more effective approaches to post-deployment reintegration and healing. Several experimental programs have adapted elements of traditional cleansing and reintegration ceremonies for use with non-native veterans, with promising preliminary results. Captain Jennifer Redhorse, a Navajo military psychologist working with the Veterans Administration, describes this development. "What many Native cultures understood, and what Begay's journal articulates so clearly, is that taking life in combat creates spiritual disharmony that requires ceremonial repair." Modern Western approaches often address only the psychological symptoms without this spiritual dimension. We're finding that ceremonial approaches, properly adapted and offered appropriately, can provide healing elements missing in conventional PTSD treatment. Beyond military and indigenous communities, the journal has had significant impact in academic circles, challenging conventional historical narratives about the Vietnam War and prompting reassessment of official accounts. Historians have been particularly interested in Begay's documentation of classified cross-border operations and encounters with Soviet and Chinese advisors, which provide new evidence for understanding the international dimensions of the conflict. Dr. Elizabeth Johnson, a historian specializing in the Vietnam War at Georgetown University, explains, "Begay's journal helps us understand Vietnam more accurately as an international proxy conflict rather than simply an American intervention in a civil war. His first-hand accounts of encounters with Russian and Chinese military personnel offer rare documentation of how directly involved these powers were in operations on the ground." The journal has also influenced scholarship on the ethical dimensions of asymmetric warfare. Begay's thoughtful reflections on targeting civilian infrastructure and individuals in non-combat roles raise questions that remain relevant to contemporary conflicts against insurgencies and non-state actors. Professor James Henderson, who teaches military ethics at the Naval War College, notes, "Begay's account is particularly valuable because he doesn't offer simplified moral judgments, but rather documents the genuine ethical complexity of the situations he faced. His entries have become case studies in our curriculum, helping future officers understand the moral dimensions of counterinsurgency operations." Perhaps the most unexpected impact of the journal has been in the field of literature. Begay's unique voice, combining technical precision about military operations with spiritual reflection and environmental observation, has been recognized for its literary merit beyond its historical value. His descriptions of the Vietnamese landscape, often drawing parallels to his Navajo homeland, are particularly noted for their poetic quality. April 5, 1970. Dawn in the Highlands. The mist rises from valleys in tendrils like smoke from 1,000 hidden fires. For a moment, the ridgelines remind me of the mesas near Chinle, the same layered relationship between earth and sky, though dressed in green rather than red and gold. Even in this place of danger and displacement, beauty persists. The Navajo understand that beauty and danger often coexist. The same magnificent storm that brings life-giving rain also delivers lightning and flood. Perhaps that is why I can still see beauty here, even through a rifle scope. Literary scholars have drawn comparisons between Begay's war writing and that of renowned authors like Tim O'Brien. But note the distinctive perspective his indigenous worldview brings to the genre. Several universities now include excerpts from the journal in courses on American literature and war writing. Dr. Catherine Whitefeather, a literary scholar who has studied the journal, observes, "What makes Begay's writing so remarkable is how it bridges worlds, indigenous and modern, spiritual and tactical, personal and geopolitical. He achieves a kind of dual consciousness, simultaneously inhabiting his role as a highly trained American sniper and his identity as a Navajo spiritual being. The result is war writing unlike anything else in American literature." As the journal's influence has spread, it has also faced criticism and controversy. Some military historians have questioned the accuracy of certain operational details, suggesting that Begay might have misunderstood the context of some missions or the identity of certain targets. Others have raised concerns about the security implications of publishing accounts of classified operations, even decades later. From within the Navajo community, some traditionalists have expressed discomfort with Begay's adaptation of sacred ceremonial practices for use in warfare, viewing this as a potential misuse of spiritual traditions. Others have defended his innovations as necessary adaptations that preserve the essential purpose of these practices under extraordinary circumstances. Political reactions have been similarly divided. Some conservative commentators have embraced Begay's account for its unapologetic portrayal of a Native American patriot serving his country with exceptional skill, while progressive voices have focused on his growing moral qualms about the war's purpose and methods. In this way, the journal has been subject to the same polarized readings that characterize much discourse about Vietnam. Dr. Blackhorse, who has followed these diverse responses with interest, reflects, "What's fascinating is how Begay's journal resists simple political categorization. He was simultaneously a highly effective warrior who took pride in his skill and service, and a spiritual being who questioned the moral foundations of the conflict. He was both a patriotic American soldier and a Navajo bound to traditional values that sometimes conflicted with his mission. This complexity challenges the oversimplified narratives both left and right often impose on Vietnam. Perhaps the most profound impact of the journal has been on individual veterans who recognized in Begay's words elements of their own unspoken experiences. Hundreds have written to Dr. Blackhorse and Marie Begay, sharing how the journal helped them articulate aspects of their service they had never been able to express, even to therapists or loved ones. One such letter, from a former Army Ranger who served in classified operations, reads, "For 50 years, I've carried these experiences alone, believing no one could understand what we did or why. Reading Begay's journal was like finding a brother I never knew I had, someone who walked the same shadows and struggled with the same questions. His words have given me permission to finally begin speaking my own truth." Marie Begay, now in her 70s, has been moved by these responses. "Thomas told me people would need to hear his words someday, but I never imagined the impact they would have. All these years later, my brother is still helping his fellow warriors find healing. That would mean everything to him." As interest in the journal has grown, efforts have been made to preserve Begay's legacy in more permanent forms. The Navajo Nation Museum has created an exhibition featuring the original journal, now carefully preserved, Trasantrihidatid on my mind tree, Begay's military equipment, and contextual materials about Navajo military service throughout American history. The exhibition includes audio recordings of selected journal entries read in both English and Navajo. Several universities have established research initiatives based on the journal. The Thomas Begay Indigenous Military Experience Archive at the University of Arizona collects and preserves accounts from Native American veterans of various conflicts, inspired by the model of Begay's detailed documentation of his service. The archive particularly focuses on how Indigenous soldiers have integrated traditional cultural practices and values with military service. Perhaps most significantly, the journal has inspired a reconsideration of how American society approaches the reintegration of combat veterans. Begay's description of struggling to return to civilian life without ceremonial cleansing and community reintegration has prompted both Native and non-Native communities to develop better rituals and supports for returning warriors. January 30th, 1971. The hardest part of returning is the absence of transition. In the traditional way, a warrior returning from battle would undergo extensive purification ceremonies before rejoining normal community life. There would be recognition of what had been experienced and what must be cleansed away. Here, I stepped from the jungle onto an airplane, and within hours was walking through San Francisco, still carrying all the spiritual residue of combat, with no ceremonial way to set it down. Some military units have begun incorporating ceremonial elements into their post-deployment processes, creating secular rituals that serve similar functions to traditional cleansing ceremonies. Several Native American tribes have opened their warrior reintegration ceremonies to non-Native veterans who express interest, sharing traditional healing practices while respecting appropriate cultural boundaries. Captain Redhorse explains. What Begay identified in his journal was the need for meaningful transition rituals, ceremonial ways to process combat experiences and reclaim civilian identity. Traditional Native cultures understood this need and developed sophisticated practices to address it. We're now seeing how these approaches can be respectfully adapted to help all veterans while acknowledging their indigenous origins. As the 5th anniversary of the journal's publication approaches, its influence continues to grow. What began as one soldier's private reflections, hidden away for decades in a cedar box, has become a significant historical document, a literary work studied in universities, a catalyst for veteran healing, and a bridge between indigenous spiritual traditions and modern military experience. Dr. Blackhorse, reflecting on this journey, observes, Thomas Begay wrote at the intersection of worlds, Navajo and American, ancient and modern, spiritual and tactical. By honestly documenting his experience from this unique vantage point, he created something that transcends conventional categories. His journal isn't just a historical account, or a spiritual testimony, or a war memoir. It's all of these simultaneously. And this multidimensional quality is what continues to make it so powerful. The final word perhaps belongs to Begay himself, who seemed to anticipate the eventual importance of his writings in one of his last journal entries, dated just weeks before his death, February 2nd, 1984. I continue to write, though I don't know who will ever read these words. Perhaps no one, perhaps many, someday when the time is right. I write because the truth must exist somewhere, even if only on these pages. There are things I've seen, things I've done, that official histories will never record. Places we fought that don't appear on any maps of the war. People who died without acknowledgement. I write for them as much as for myself, to testify that they existed, that what happened was real, even if never officially admitted. And I write for those who might someday walk similar paths between worlds, carrying ancient wisdom into modern wars. May they find in these pages some recognition of their experience, some validation of their dual consciousness, some guidance for maintaining balance when everything around them threatens to destroy it. For the veterans who now find in Begay's words the recognition and validation he hoped to provide, the journal has become a sacred text of sorts, a testament that breaks the silence surrounding experiences long suppressed and offers a path toward integration and healing. Through his writings, this Navajo warrior who walked between worlds continues to guide others on their journey home from war. The revelation of Thomas Begay's journal has forced a reckoning with aspects of the Vietnam War that official narratives had long obscured or minimized. It has validated the experiences of veterans who served in classified operations and provided new perspectives on the spiritual and psychological dimensions of combat. It has created bridges between indigenous and non-indigenous approaches to warfare and healing. And it has demonstrated how traditional wisdom can provide guidance even in circumstances far removed from its origins. As we continue to process the complex legacy of Vietnam and engage with more recent conflicts, Begay's unique voice offers valuable insights that transcend conventional political and historical categories. His dual consciousness, as both a highly skilled American warrior and a Navajo spiritual being, provides a model for holding complexity rather than reducing difficult experiences to simplified narratives. In breaking the silence that surrounded so many aspects of the Vietnam War, Begay's journal has created space for other silences to be broken, for veterans to speak previously unspoken truths, for indigenous perspectives to enter mainstream discourse about warfare, for complex moral questions to be examined without reductive judgment. In this way, the quiet observations of one thoughtful warrior, recorded in solitude during and after his service, have created ripples of healing and understanding that continue to spread outward. For those who serve in today's conflicts, Begay's journal offers both practical wisdom about maintaining psychological and spiritual balance under extreme conditions and a model for honest documentation that might benefit future generations. His example suggests that even in the most challenging circumstances, maintaining connection to cultural roots and carefully observing one's internal responses can create resilience and preserve core humanity. And for all who seek to understand the full dimensions of warfare and its impacts on those who wage it, Begay's writings provide a rare window into experiences that are often rendered invisible in both official histories and popular accounts. By sharing his journey through the physical, psychological, and spiritual landscapes of combat, he allows readers to comprehend aspects of warfare that statistics and strategic analyses can never capture. The silence that initially greeted the journal's revelations, the stunned quiet of veterans who finally saw their unspoken experiences reflected back to them with perfect clarity, has gradually transformed into new conversations, new understandings, and new approaches to healing. In breaking one silence, Begay's words have created the possibility for many other silences to be broken, and for new forms of integration and wholeness to emerge from fragmented experiences. As we conclude this exploration of Thomas Begay's remarkable journal and its continuing impact, we're reminded of the power of honest testimony to transcend time, bridge cultural divides, and create healing where there has been wounding. We're reminded that wisdom can emerge from the most difficult experiences when approached with spiritual awareness and moral reflection. And we're reminded that sometimes the most important truths are preserved not in official histories, but in the private writings of those who experienced events firsthand, with clear eyes and open hearts. For the veterans still carrying the weight of unacknowledged experiences, for indigenous people navigating the complexities of maintaining traditional values in modern contexts, and for all who seek deeper understanding of warfare's human dimensions, Thomas Begay's journal stands as both testimony and invitation. Testimony to what has been experienced, an invitation to engage with difficult truths in ways that lead toward healing rather than deeper division. May his words continue to bring light to shadowed experiences, voice to silenced truths, and healing to wounded spirits. And may we honor his legacy by creating a world where warriors are properly prepared for the spiritual dimensions of combat and properly reintegrated into community afterward, where the wisdom of ancient traditions informs our approach to modern challenges, and where truth, however difficult, is acknowledged rather than suppressed. As Begay himself might have put it, drawing on Navajo concepts. May we walk in beauty, in balance between remembering and healing, between honoring sacrifice and preventing unnecessary suffering, between respecting traditional wisdom and meeting the unique challenges of our time. In this balanced path lies the greatest honor we can offer to Thomas Begay and all who have walked similar journeys between worlds. Let us pray that the Great Spirit continues to guide us toward deeper understanding and healing. May the sacred traditions that sustained Thomas Begay in his darkest moments continue to provide wisdom and strength to those who serve in difficult circumstances. May Christ's promise that the truth shall set you free be fulfilled in the honest reckoning with history that Begay's journal has inspired. And may we all find the courage to break silences that need breaking, to speak truths that need speaking, and to create ceremonies of healing where they are needed most. Amen?
At 06:15 on July 30th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth crawled into the tail position of B-17 Tondaleo at RAF Kimbolton, watching a gray English dawn that would carry him 500 miles into Germany. 24 years old, 12 combat missions, 3 confirmed kills. The Luftwaffe had positioned over 300 fighters along the route to Kassel. Aruth settled onto the bicycle seat that served as his workstation. The tail gunner position measured 4 feet wide and 5 feet long. 2 Browning M250 caliber machine guns pointed backward through a plexiglass window. At 25,000 feet, the temperature outside would drop to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. His electrically heated suit was the only thing between survival and death by hypothermia. The 8th Air Force called it the loneliest job in the war. The tail gunner worked alone, separated from the rest of the crew by 40 feet of aluminum fuselage. No one to talk to, no one to help if something went wrong, just a man, 2 guns, and whatever the Luftwaffe sent his way. The statistics told the story. In the summer of 1943, the average B-17 crew survived 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Tail gunners died faster than anyone except ball turret gunners. German fighter pilots preferred attacking from the rear. The tail position absorbed the first bullets. By July, the 379th Bombardment Group had already lost 9 aircraft in just 2 months of operations. 90 men, gone. The problem was geometry. German pilots understood that approaching from behind gave them the longest possible firing window. A Messerschmitt Bf-109, closing at 350 miles per hour from the 6 o'clock position, had nearly 10 seconds to aim and fire before passing the bomber. The tail gunner had those same 10 seconds to hit a target moving at combined speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. Most tail gunners never got the chance. The Focke-Wulf 190 carried 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. A single burst could shred the plexiglass bubble, kill the gunner, and disable the tail controls. Bombers without tail protection became easy targets. The fighters would circle back, line up, and finish the job. The Standard Army Air Force's gunnery training taught gunners to wait, conserve ammunition, fire only at ranges under 300 yards. The theory made sense in a classroom. In combat, 300 yards meant the enemy was already shooting. By the time a tail gunner opened fire, he might already be dead. Aruth had watched it happen. On his 6th mission, a B-17 flying off Tondaleo's right wing took a direct hit to the tail section. The gunner never fired a shot. The fighter came in fast, guns blazing, and the first rounds punched through the plexiglass before the American could react. The bomber fell out of formation trailing smoke. 8 parachutes emerged. The tail gunner was not among them. The official doctrine demanded patience. Aruth questioned everything about it. The fighters attacked from maximum range because they knew American gunners would hold fire. The Luftwaffe pilots had learned the patterns. They exploited the training manual like a roadmap. If you want to see how Aruth challenged the doctrine that was getting tail gunners killed, please hit that like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Aruth. 186 B-17s lifted off from bases across eastern England that morning. 123 P-47 Thunderbolts would escort them part way, but fuel limitations meant the fighters would turn back over Belgium. The bombers would fly the final 200 miles to Kassel alone. Aruth checked his ammunition belts. 400 rounds per gun, 800 total. The manual said that was enough for a standard mission. Aruth had already decided the manual was wrong about everything else. By noon, he would find out if he was right. The cost of being wrong was a closed casket funeral and a telegram to his family. The formation crossed the English Channel at 14,000 feet, still climbing. Aruth watched the water recede through his plexiglass window, the white cliffs of Dover shrinking to a pale line on the horizon. Ahead lay occupied France, then Belgium, then the heart of Nazi Germany. The P-47 escorts held position around the bomber stream. Their presence meant safety, but Aruth knew the arithmetic. The Thunderbolts carried enough fuel for roughly 90 minutes of combat flying. The mission to Kassel would take 6 hours. For most of the journey, the bombers would fly alone. Aruth had spent his first missions following doctrine: wait for the fighter to close, aim carefully, fire in short bursts, conserve ammunition. The training instructors at gunnery school had drilled it into every student. Ammunition was limited. Accuracy mattered more than volume. A disciplined gunner could make 800 rounds last an entire mission. The doctrine assumed the enemy would cooperate. The Luftwaffe did not. German pilots had studied American tactics. They knew the gunners waited until 300 yards, so they opened fire at 600 yards, pouring cannon shells into the bomber formations while the Americans held their triggers. By the time the tail gunners started shooting, the damage was already done. Aruth had calculated the problem differently. A Focke-Wulf 190 at 600 yards was not a difficult target. It was flying straight toward him, nose pointed directly at his position, presenting the largest possible profile. The closure rate meant the apparent size doubled every few seconds. A gunner who started firing early could walk his tracers onto the target, adjusting aim as the range decreased. The risk was ammunition. 800 rounds sounded like a lot until you divided it by the number of attacking fighters. A mission might see 15, 20, even 30 separate attacks. At 50 rounds per burst, the mathematics turned brutal. A gunner who fired early might run dry before the mission ended. Aruth accepted the trade-off. A gunner who conserved ammunition but died on the third attack had made a poor bargain. Survival required disrupting the enemy's attack before it succeeded. If that meant running low on bullets, he would deal with that problem later. Dead men had no use for reserve ammunition. His first test came on his fourth mission, a raid against submarine pens at St. Nazaire in June. A pair of Bf-109s approached from the 6 o'clock low position, the classic tail attack. Standard doctrine said wait. Aruth opened fire at 700 yards. The tracers arced across the sky, falling short at first, then climbing toward the lead fighter. The German pilot saw the fire coming and broke off his attack, diving away before reaching effective cannon range. His wingman followed. Neither fighter scored a hit on Tondaleo. The crew chief questioned Aruth after landing. The ammunition count showed he had expended nearly 200 rounds on a single engagement. At that rate, he would run out before reaching targets deep inside Germany. Aruth explained his reasoning. The crew chief remained skeptical. Other tail gunners heard about the incident. Some called it reckless. Wasting ammunition on long-range shots violated everything the Army Air Forces taught. The training manuals existed for reasons. Aruth was gambling with his crew's lives. But Tondaleo kept coming home. Mission after mission, the bomber returned to Kimbolton with its crew intact. Other aircraft in the 527th Squadron were not so fortunate. By mid-July, 3 bombers from the squadron had gone down, 30 men lost. Now, crossing into Belgium on July 30th, Aruth watched the P-47 escorts waggle their wings and turn back toward England. The fuel gauges in the Thunderbolts demanded retreat. The bombers pressed on alone. Somewhere ahead, 300 German fighters were waiting. Aruth would need every round he had. He would also need to survive long enough to use them. The first Messerschmitts appeared at 11:42, climbing from the southeast in groups of 4. Aruth counted 8, then 12, then stopped counting. The sky behind Tandaleo filled with black crosses on yellow noses. The lead fighter began its attack run from the 6 o'clock high position, diving toward the bomber formation at 400 miles per hour. Aruth tracked the aircraft through his gun sight, watching the wingspan grow larger with each passing second. At 800 yards, he squeezed both triggers. The twin Brownings roared to life, sending a stream of tracers across the sky. The first rounds fell short, disappearing into empty air below the diving fighter. Aruth adjusted, walking the fire upward. At 600 yards, the tracers began connecting. Bright flashes sparked along the Messerschmitt's engine cowling. The German pilot broke hard right, smoke trailing from his aircraft. He never completed his firing pass. The fighter spiraled downward, disappearing into the cloud layer below. Aruth had no time to watch. The second attacker was already closing. This one came in lower, trying to slip beneath Aruth's field of fire. The angle was difficult, requiring him to depress his guns nearly to their mechanical limit. He fired anyway, sending a long burst toward the approaching fighter. The Focke-Wulf pilot flinched, pulling up early and releasing his cannon shells into empty sky above Tandaleo. The attacks continued for 47 minutes. Wave after wave of German fighters slashed through the bomber formation, targeting stragglers and damaged aircraft. Aruth fired at everything that came within range, burning through ammunition at 3 times the recommended rate. His gun barrels glowed red from sustained fire. At 12:29, a Bf-109 approached from directly astern, flying straight and level. The pilot had either extraordinary courage or poor judgment. Aruth centered the fighter in his gun sight and held the triggers down. The Brownings hammered for 6 continuous seconds, pouring over 100 rounds into the approaching aircraft. The Messerschmitt disintegrated. The engine separated from the fuselage. The wings folded backward. What remained of the fighter tumbled past Tandaleo, close enough for Aruth to see the empty cockpit. The pilot had either ejected or died at the controls. 2 confirmed kills. Ammunition down to 180 rounds. The formation reached Cassel at 12:51 and began its bombing run. For 11 minutes, the bombers flew straight and level, unable to maneuver while the bombardiers lined up their targets. The Luftwaffe knew this moment represented maximum vulnerability. The fighters pressed their attacks with renewed fury. A Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tandaleo from the 5 o'clock position. Aruth swung his guns to meet it, firing a short burst. The rounds struck the fighter's wing root. The pilot kept coming, cannon shells tearing through Tandaleo's tail section. Aruth felt the impacts before he felt the pain. 20-millimeter fragments ripped through the plexiglass, shredding his flight suit and burying themselves in his left arm and shoulder. His left gun jammed. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the compartment. He kept firing with the right gun. One-handed, bleeding, he tracked the wounded Focke-Wulf as it pulled away. A final burst caught the fighter's tail assembly. The aircraft snap-rolled and dove toward the ground. His 3rd kill of the mission. The intercom crackled with voices from the crew. Someone was asking about damage. Someone else reported flak ahead. Aruth tried to respond, but his throat had gone dry. Blood pooled on the floor of his compartment, freezing almost instantly in the sub-zero air. 400 rounds expended, 63 remaining. 3 German fighters destroyed, and the mission was only half over. Tandaleo still had to fly 250 miles back to England through the same gauntlet of fighters that had nearly killed him on the way in. Aruth wrapped a scarf around his wounded arm and waited for the next attack. The return flight began at 13:04. Tandaleo turned westward with 185 other bombers, leaving Kassel burning beneath a column of black smoke. Aruth remained at his position, scanning the sky through blood-smeared plexiglass. The Luftwaffe was not finished. German fighters regrouped over Belgium, positioning themselves along the bomber stream's route to the English Channel. Fresh aircraft replaced those lost or damaged in the morning attacks. The second gauntlet would be as dangerous as the first. Aruth's left arm had gone numb from the cold and the wounds. His jammed gun remained inoperable, the feed mechanism shattered by the same cannon shell that had injured him. He had one functioning weapon and 63 rounds of ammunition to cover 250 miles of hostile airspace. The mathematics demanded a different approach. At 63 rounds, he could afford perhaps 3 engagements of 20 rounds each. Every trigger pull had to count. The luxury of suppressive fire was gone. At 13:31, a pair of BF-109s closed from the 7 o'clock position. Aruth waited until 500 yards, then fired a precise 12-round burst at the lead fighter. The tracers struck the engine cowling. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove away, trailing glycol coolant. The wingman broke off without attacking. 51 rounds remaining. Tondeleau crossed into France at 14:15. The fighter attacks diminished as the Luftwaffe reached the limit of their operational range. By 14:47, the bomber formation had outrun the last German interceptors. The English Channel appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later. The landing at Kimbolton came at 15:52. Aruth could not climb out of his compartment without assistance. Ground crew pulled him through the narrow hatch and carried him to a waiting ambulance. The flight surgeon counted 11 separate fragment wounds in his arm, shoulder, and upper back. Word spread through the 379th Bombardment Group within hours. The tail gunner on Tondeleau had scored 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables while wounded, operating a single gun with 63 rounds of ammunition. The Mission Intelligence Report noted his early engagement technique as a contributing factor to the bomber's survival. Other tail gunners began asking questions. The standard doctrine said wait until 300 yards. Aruth had opened fire at 800. The doctrine said conserve ammunition. Aruth had burned through 700 rounds before getting hit. The doctrine produced dead gunners. Aruth was still alive. The 527th Squadron's gunnery officer reviewed the combat footage from Tondeleau's mission. The gun camera showed Aruth's tracers reaching out far beyond normal engagement range, disrupting attack runs before the German pilots could establish firing solutions. The early fire forced the enemy to maneuver, degrading their accuracy and reducing hits on the bomber. By mid-August, 3 other tail gunners in the squadron had adopted variations of Aruth's technique. Their survival rates improved. The bombers they protected returned with less damage. The correlation was difficult to ignore. The 379th Group Commander received a preliminary report on September 1st. The data suggested that aggressive early fire reduced bomber casualties by disrupting coordinated fighter attacks. The implications challenged 2 years of established gunnery doctrine. Meanwhile, Aruth recovered from his wounds at the station hospital. The fragment damage had missed major blood vessels and nerves. The flight surgeon cleared him for duty on August 19th, 3 weeks after the Castle mission. Tondeleau had a new aircraft waiting. The old bomber had been written off after accumulating too much battle damage for economical repair. The replacement carried the same name and the same crew. Aruth climbed back into the tail position on August 26th. The Luftwaffe had noticed something changing in the American bomber formations. Their intelligence officers were studying the problem. Luftwaffe intelligence officers noticed the pattern in early September. American tail gunners were opening fire earlier, sometimes at ranges exceeding 600 yards. The change disrupted attack formations that had worked reliably for months. German fighter pilots reported the shift in debriefings across occupied Europe. The approach from 6 o'clock, once the safest angle against B-17 formations, was becoming increasingly dangerous. Tracers reached out before pilots could establish stable firing platforms. The psychological effect was significant. A pilot watching tracers stream toward his aircraft at long range instinctively maneuvered, even when the rounds were falling short. The Luftwaffe's tactical response came in 3 phases. First, they increased approach speeds, diving on bomber formations at maximum velocity to reduce exposure time. Second, they shifted attack angles, approaching from the high 6 o'clock position where gravity would assist their pullout. Third, they began targeting specific aircraft that appeared to have aggressive gunners, hoping to eliminate the threat before it could spread. None of these adaptations solved the fundamental problem. Faster approaches meant less accurate shooting. Steeper angles increased the difficulty of tracking targets through the dive. Targeting aggressive gunners required identifying them in advance, which was nearly impossible in the chaos of a running air battle. The 379th Bombardment Group flew 11 missions between August 26th and September 5th. Aruth participated in 4 of them, adding 2 more confirmed kills to his record. Other tail gunners in the group claimed an additional 7. The Luftwaffe's loss ratio against the Triangle K bombers was climbing. German fighter commanders tried concentrating their attacks. Instead of spreading interceptors across the entire bomber stream, they massed against single groups, hoping to overwhelm defensive fire through sheer numbers. The tactic produced results on September 3rd, when concentrated attacks against the 100th Bombardment Group destroyed 8 aircraft in 15 minutes. The 379th escaped that slaughter by flying in a different position within the combat box, but the lesson was clear. The Luftwaffe was adapting, searching for weaknesses in the new defensive approach. The air war over Europe had become a contest of tactical innovation, with each side studying the other's methods and developing countermeasures. Aruth understood the stakes. His technique worked because it surprised the enemy. Once the Germans developed effective responses, the advantage would disappear. Every mission was a test, every engagement a data point that both sides would analyze. The temporary edge that aggressive fire provided was eroding with each passing week. The mission scheduled for September 6th would target Stuttgart, deep in southern Germany. The route would carry the bombers over 500 miles of enemy territory, the longest penetration the 8th Air Force had attempted that month. Intelligence predicted heavy fighter opposition from bases in France, Belgium, and Germany itself. Stuttgart manufactured ball bearings, components essential to every vehicle, aircraft, and weapon in the German arsenal. The strategic importance made it one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Flak batteries ringed the city. Fighter squadrons were positioned along every likely approach route. The briefing on September 5th laid out the challenge. The 379th would fly in the lead position of the combat wing, responsible for navigation and bomb aiming for the formations following behind. Lead position meant absorbing the first fighter attacks. It meant flying straight and level while other groups maneuvered. It meant maximum exposure to everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. Aruth checked his guns that evening. Both Brownings were freshly serviced, the feed mechanism smooth, the barrels replaced after accumulating too many rounds. He loaded 1,200 rounds instead of the standard 800. The extra ammunition added weight, but weight seemed less important than firepower. Tomorrow would test everything he had learned. Tomorrow would determine whether his methods could survive the most dangerous mission of his career. The Stuttgart mission launched at 0540 on September 6th. 187 bombers climbed into an overcast English sky, forming up over the North Sea before turning southeast toward occupied Europe. Tondileo flew in the lead element of the 379th Formation, positioned where Aruth would face the first attacks from any direction. The fighters found them over France at 0915. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rose from airfields across the region, climbing to intercept the bomber stream before it reached German airspace. The initial attacks came from the 11 o'clock position, head-on passes that tested the nose gunners rather than the tail. Aruth waited, watching contrails multiply behind the formation. The Luftwaffe was building strength, assembling fighters from multiple units into a concentrated force. By 0940, intelligence estimates counted over 100 interceptors tracking the bombers. The rear attacks began at 10:08. A staffel of 12 Bf-109s positioned themselves 2,000 feet below the formation, then pulled up in a climbing attack from the 6 o'clock low. Aruth opened fire at 700 yards, sending tracers into the lead element. 2 fighters broke off immediately. A third absorbed multiple hits and fell away smoking. The remaining 9 pressed their attack. Cannon shells ripped through the formation, striking bombers throughout the 379th's combat box. The B-17 flying off Tondileo's left wing took hits to its number 3 engine. Another bomber in the low squadron began trailing fuel from ruptured tanks. Aruth kept firing, shifting from target to target as fighters flashed through his field of view. His ammunition counter dropped steadily. 600 rounds. 500. 400. The attacks showed no sign of diminishing. At 10:31, a Focke-Wulf 190 dove on Tondileo from directly above and behind, using the sun to mask its approach. Aruth spotted the fighter too late. 20mm shells punched through the tail section before he could bring his guns to bear. The impacts threw him against the plexiglass. His left gun was destroyed, the receiver shattered by a direct hit. Fragments tore through his flight suit, opening wounds across his arms and scalp. Blood poured down his face, partially blinding him. He kept firing with the right gun. The Focke-Wulf pulled up and rolled away, trailing smoke from hits scored during its dive. Aruth wiped blood from his eyes and searched for the next attacker. Tandaleo was dying. The fighter's cannon fire had severed hydraulic lines, damaged the tail controls, and punctured fuel tanks in the wing roots. The pilots fought to maintain altitude, but the bomber was losing the battle against gravity and aerodynamics. The formation reached Stuttgart at 11:04. Tandaleo held position long enough to release its bombs over the target, then fell out of formation as the damage overwhelmed the crew's ability to compensate. 2 engines were running rough. The fuel situation was critical. The pilots made the decision over eastern France. Tandaleo could not reach England. The best option was a controlled ditching in the English Channel, where air-sea rescue units might reach them before hypothermia set in. Aruth remained at his position as the bomber descended, watching for fighters that might pursue the crippled aircraft. None came. The Luftwaffe had other targets, healthier bombers still flying in formation. Tandaleo hit the channel at 15:12, impacting the gray water at 120 miles per hour. The fuselage broke apart on impact. Aruth was thrown forward, his head striking the gun mount. Darkness. When he regained consciousness, he was floating in a life raft. British rescue boats were approaching. All 10 crew members had survived the ditching. The bomber that had carried them through 17 missions lay at the bottom of the English Channel. The 379th's commander was already requesting Aruth's mission reports. The Distinguished Service Cross citation arrived on October 14, 1943. The second highest military decoration the United States Army could award, recognized Aruth's actions during the Kassel and Stuttgart missions. The citation specifically mentioned his decision to continue firing while wounded, crediting his defensive fire with protecting the bomber during its most vulnerable moments. The 8th Air Force's gunnery staff had completed their analysis by late October. The data covered 14 bomber groups across 3 months of operations. The conclusions challenged assumptions that had governed American air combat since 1942. Tail gunners, who engaged targets beyond 500 yards, showed measurably higher survival rates than those who followed standard doctrine. The early fire disrupted enemy formations, forcing German pilots to maneuver defensively rather than establishing stable firing platforms. The ammunition cost was significant, but the trade-off favored the aggressive approach. Brigadier General Frederick Anderson, commander of 8th Bomber Command's operational planning, reviewed the findings personally. The implications extended beyond individual aircraft. If coordinated early fire from multiple bombers could disrupt massed fighter attacks, the entire defensive doctrine might require revision. The formal policy change came in November. New gunnery guidelines authorized tail gunners to engage targets at extended ranges when tactical conditions permitted. The bureaucratic language was cautious, but the meaning was clear. The approach that had kept Aruth alive was becoming official doctrine. Aruth never saw the policy take full effect. His head injuries from the Stuttgart ditching proved more serious than initial assessments indicated. After returning to flight status in late September, he completed 3 additional missions before medical officers grounded him permanently. Recurring headaches and vision problems made continued combat duty impossible. His final tally stood at 17 confirmed kills, with 4 additional probables awaiting verification. The number placed him among the highest-scoring bomber gunners in the 8th Air Force. Some records credited him with as many as 19 victories, though documentation inconsistencies made precise counts difficult. The Distinguished Flying Cross followed the Distinguished Service Cross. 2 air medals with oak leaf clusters recognized his cumulative combat achievements. The Purple Heart acknowledged his wounds. By the time his combat career ended, Aruth had accumulated more decorations than most pilots. The 379th Bombardment Group continued operations for another 18 months, flying through the winter of 43, the invasion summer of 44, and the final campaigns of 45. The tactics Aruth had pioneered spread throughout 8th Bomber Command. tail gunners across the 8th Air Force adopted variations of early engagement doctrine. The statistical impact emerged gradually. Bomber loss rates declined through 1944, though multiple factors contributed. Longer-range fighter escorts reduced exposure to unprotected combat. Improved aircraft systems enhanced survivability. But defensive gunnery also played a role, and the shift toward aggressive fire was part of that improvement. German fighter pilots noticed the change. Interrogation reports from captured Luftwaffe aircrew mentioned the increased danger of tail attacks against American formations. The easy kills that had characterized early bomber interceptions became progressively harder to achieve. Some pilots shifted entirely to head-on attacks, accepting the higher closure rates in exchange for avoiding concentrated rear hemisphere fire. Aruth shipped home to the United States in early 1944. The Army Air Forces assigned him to training duties, passing his combat experience to new gunners preparing for deployment overseas. He spent the remainder of the war teaching others the techniques that had kept him alive. The students who passed through his courses carried his methods into combat over Germany, over Japan, over every theater where American bombers faced enemy fighters. What he did after the war surprised everyone who knew him. Michael Aruth did not leave military service after the war ended. He transferred to the newly formed United States Air Force in 1947 and continued serving for another 15 years. The man who had survived the deadliest skies over Europe chose to remain in uniform until 1962, retiring at the rank of Master Sergeant. The decision puzzled some who knew his history. Aruth had accumulated enough combat experience for several lifetimes. He had been wounded twice, ditched in the English Channel, and faced death more times than official records could capture. Most veterans with similar experiences wanted nothing more than civilian life. Aruth saw it differently. The Air Force had given him purpose during the darkest years of the century. The skills he developed had saved lives, not just his own, but the crews who flew with him and the gunners who learned from his methods. Walking away felt like abandoning something important. His post-war years were quiet. He married, raised a family, and rarely spoke about his combat experiences. The medals stayed in a drawer. The memories stayed locked away. Like many veterans of his generation, Aruth believed that those who had not been there could never truly understand. Elmer Bendener, Tondeleo's navigator, took a different path. He became a journalist and author, eventually writing a memoir titled The Fall of Fortresses. The book described the crew's experiences in detail, preserving moments that might otherwise have been lost to history. Bendener's account ensured that the Tondileo and her crew would not be forgotten. The 379th Bombardment Group held reunions for decades after the war. Veterans gathered to remember friends who had not returned, to share stories that their families had never heard, to honor the young men they had once been. Aruth attended when his health permitted, reconnecting with survivors from those desperate months over Europe. The National Memorial Cemetery of Arizona received his remains on February 20th, 1990. He had died 5 days earlier in St. Augustine, Florida, at the age of 70. The headstone listed his rank, his service branch, and his war. It did not mention the 17 fighters he had destroyed, or the crews he had protected, or the doctrine he had helped reshape. Military cemeteries are full of such understatements. The stones mark names and dates, but cannot capture the weight of what those names represent. Aruth lies among thousands of other veterans, each with stories that deserve telling. The mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia, preserves the history of the bomber crews who flew from England. The 379th Bombardment Group's records are archived there, including mission reports that document Aruth's combat achievements. Researchers can trace the evolution of gunnery doctrine through documents that bear his influence. The B-17 tail gunner position no longer exists. The aircraft that carried men like Aruth into combat have mostly vanished, reduced to museum pieces and memorial displays. But the principles he demonstrated, the value of aggressive action over passive defense, the willingness to challenge doctrine that was getting men killed, those principles endure. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about tail gunners who protected their crews with courage and innovation. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Michael Aruth does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen. May 12, 1945. A muddy trench in the Burmese jungle. 3 Gurkha riflemen crouched in darkness, listening to the sounds of at least 200 Japanese soldiers creeping through the undergrowth toward their position. Rifleman Lachiman Gurung, 27 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall, gripped his Lee Enfield rifle and waited. His post was the most forward position of the entire British defensive line, the key to the whole perimeter. If it fell, the Japanese would roll up the flank and slaughter 2 companies of surrounded Gurkhas. At 1:20 in the morning, the grenades started falling. Gurung watched the first one arc through the darkness and land just outside his trench. He scooped it up, threw it back. The explosion lit up the jungle for a split second, revealing dozens of Japanese soldiers rushing his position. Another grenade fell inside the trench. Gurung grabbed it, hurled it at the attackers. It detonated in midair. A third grenade landed at his feet. He reached down, picked it up, and this one exploded in his hand. The blast tore off the fingers of his right hand. Shrapnel ripped into his face, destroying his right eye. Burns covered his arm, chest, and legs. The other 2 Gurkhas in the trench were wounded by the same explosion, and 200 Japanese soldiers were charging straight at them, screaming, firing, throwing more grenades. Gurung was bleeding, half blind, missing most of his right hand. Any rational soldier would surrender or die. Lachiman Gurung grabbed his rifle with his left hand and started killing. For the next 4 hours, he held that trench alone, firing, reloading, firing again, one-handed, screaming at the Japanese to come and fight a Gurkha. When dawn broke and the Japanese finally retreated, 31 enemy bodies lay in front of his position. 31 soldiers killed by one man, with one hand. A man who, according to every rule of warfare, should have been dead in the first minute of combat. This is the untold story of the most incredible one-man stand in World War II history. From the mountain village in Nepal, where a boy joined the British Army to escape poverty, to the Burma campaign, where the Imperial Japanese Army learned what happened when you attacked a Gurkha who refused to die. From the moment a grenade destroyed his hand, to the 4 hours of hell that earned him the Victoria Cross, discover how one rifleman proved that courage doesn't require 2 hands, it just requires refusing to quit. Nepal, December 1917. Lachiman Gurung was born in Dahakani, a tiny village in the hills west of Kathmandu. His father farmed a small plot of land, barely enough to feed the family. Life in the Nepalese mountains meant poverty, hard work, and few opportunities. Young men had 2 choices: farm like their fathers, or join the British Indian Army as Gurkhas, the legendary soldiers from Nepal who had served Britain since 1815. The Gurkhas had a reputation that terrified enemies across the British Empire. Fearless, disciplined, armed with the curved kukri knife that every Gurkha carried and knew how to use with devastating effect. British commanders valued them above almost any other infantry. German soldiers in both world wars learned to dread facing Gurkha regiments. So did Japanese troops in Burma. The Gurkha motto was simple: better to die than be a coward. Gurung grew up hearing stories of Gurkha heroes, men from villages like his who had earned medals fighting for Britain in India, Afghanistan, France. The army offered steady pay, respect, a way out of subsistence farming. But joining required passing a brutal selection process and meeting the minimum height requirement, 5 feet tall. Gurung stood 4 feet 11 inches, shorter than the requirement. Under normal circumstances, he would have been rejected. But circumstances in 1940 were not normal. In December of that year, Gurung walked to the British recruitment station. World War II was expanding rapidly. Germany controlled most of Europe. Japan was preparing to sweep through Asia. Britain needed soldiers desperately. The height requirements were quietly relaxed. Gurung was accepted. He was 23 years old. He joined the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, one of the most storied regiments in the British Indian Army. The story of how he came to enlist has been told many ways over the years. One version says his father sent him to the village store to buy cigarettes. He met a friend who was enlisting. They went to the recruitment station together. Gurung never came home with the cigarettes. He disappeared into the army. 5 years later, he returned, missing an eye and most of his right hand. His father got the story instead of cigarettes. Whether that tale is true or embellished, the facts are clear. Gurung enlisted in December 1940. He completed training, learned to handle the Lee Enfield rifle, mastered the tactics of jungle warfare, absorbed the Gurkha code, aggression in attack, stubbornness in defense, never surrender, never retreat unless ordered, fight to the last man and the last round. These weren't just words, they were the core of Gurkha identity. By 1944, Gurung's battalion was deployed to Burma. The Burma campaign was one of the most brutal theaters of World War II. Dense jungle, monsoon rains, diseases like malaria and dysentery that killed as many soldiers as combat, and the Imperial Japanese Army, which had conquered most of Southeast Asia in 1942 and showed no mercy to enemies or prisoners. Japanese soldiers had orders to fight to the death. They expected their opponents to do the same. Surrender was disgrace. Capture meant torture. The British and Indian forces had been slowly pushing the Japanese back through Burma since 1944. Operation Extended Capital aimed to recapture central Burma and cut off Japanese supply lines. The 8th Gurkha Rifles were part of this offensive. They fought through swamps, across rivers, and up jungle-covered hills. Every advance meant ambushes, snipers, and fanatical Japanese defenders who would rather die than retreat. By May 1945, the Japanese position in Burma was collapsing. Allied forces had crossed the Irrawaddy River. They were pushing toward Rangoon, but the Japanese weren't beaten yet. Scattered units were trying to break out of encirclement, retreating south. Desperate, dangerous, willing to attack anything in their path to escape the closing trap. On May 9th, the 4th Battalion of the 8th Gurkha Rifles was ordered to block the Japanese withdrawal routes near the village of Tongda. The terrain was dense jungle with a few muddy trails. The monsoon rains had started. Everything was wet, slippery, miserable. The Gurkhas dug defensive positions and waited. Intelligence reported Japanese forces were moving through the area. No one knew exactly how many. No one knew when they would attack, just that they were coming. Gurung's company, C Company, was positioned on a reverse slope. Trenches dug into the hillside, overlapping fields of fire, standard defensive tactics. But the jungle limited visibility to a few dozen yards in most directions. The Japanese could get close before being spotted. They were experts at infiltration, moving silently, attacking at night, overrunning positions before defenders could react. The Gurkhas had fought them before. They knew what to expect. Violence, speed, grenades, close combat with bayonets and knives. Gurung's section was assigned to the most forward post, 3 men in a trench about 100 yards ahead of the main British line. Their job was simple and suicidal. Provide early warning. Slow down any Japanese attack. Give the rest of the company time to respond. It was the most dangerous position in the entire defensive perimeter, the first to be hit, the hardest to reinforce, the most likely to be overrun. Gurung and 2 other Gurkhas occupied that forward trench. They improved the position as much as possible, deepened the trench, piled sandbags, cleared fields of fire, placed ammunition within easy reach. Gurung also placed his kukri knife on the parapet of the trench, within arm's reach. If the Japanese got that close, he would need it. That curved blade had killed enemies for generations of Gurkhas. He wasn't going to be different. On the night of May 12, the Japanese came. Not a probe, not a patrol, a full assault. At least 200 soldiers hitting C Company's position with everything they had. Grenades, machine guns, rifles, screaming charges designed to panic defenders and break through the perimeter. The entire attack was aimed at one section of the line, Gurung's section, his trench, the key to the whole position. At 1:20 in the morning, Naik Dibasingbura, Gurung's section commander, had just gotten all his men to stand to in their trenches when the grenades started falling. Japanese soldiers were creeping close under cover of darkness, throwing grenades to soften up the defenses before the main assault. Buddha watched from his trench a few yards behind Gurung's position. He saw a grenade land near Gurung's trench, saw Gurung scoop it up and hurl it back at the enemy. The explosion lit up the jungle, revealed dozens of Japanese soldiers rushing forward. Seconds later, another grenade fell inside Gurung's trench. He grabbed it, threw it out. It exploded in the air. Japanese soldiers were screaming, firing, getting closer. A third grenade arced through the darkness and landed right at Gurung's feet. He bent down, picked it up, and it detonated before he could throw it. The blast was catastrophic. The grenade exploded in his right hand, tore off his fingers, mangled his palm. Shrapnel ripped into his face, destroying his right eye. Burns covered his right arm, chest, face. Fragments hit his legs. The force of the explosion threw him backward. Blood poured from dozens of wounds. The other two Gurkhas in the trench were hit by the same blast, all 3 men wounded. And 200 Japanese soldiers were seconds away from overrunning the position. The 2 other Gurkhas in the trench were badly wounded, unable to fight, bleeding, disoriented. The Japanese assault was seconds away from overwhelming the position. Any other soldier would have abandoned the trench, fallen back to the main line, sought medical attention. Survival instinct would have demanded it. But Lachiman Gurung didn't retreat. He didn't even hesitate. He grabbed his rifle with his left hand. The Lee Enfield was designed to be fired right-handed. The bolt action required the right hand to cycle rounds. Gurung's right hand was destroyed, a mangled mess of blood and bone. It no longer worked. So he improvised. He braced the rifle against his left hip, worked the bolt with his left hand, aimed with his one remaining eye, and started firing at the shadows rushing toward him through the darkness. The Japanese soldiers expected to find dead or dying defenders. They expected to overrun the trench in seconds. What they found instead was a Gurkha rifleman who was shooting back, accurately, rapidly, killing the lead attackers, screaming at them in Gurkhali, telling them to come and fight, challenging them, refusing to die. The shock of it stopped the Japanese advance cold for precious seconds, long enough for Gurung to kill several more soldiers, long enough for confusion to ripple through the Japanese ranks. The attackers adjusted. More grenades fell into and around Gurung's trench. He couldn't throw them back anymore. His right hand was useless. He pressed himself against the trench wall, let the explosions wash over him, took more shrapnel wounds, more burns, kept firing. The Japanese tried rushing the position. Gurung shot them down, one after another. The bodies piled up in front of his trench. The dead became obstacles that slowed the living. From his position behind Gurung, Naik Dibasingbura watched in disbelief. He had seen combat before. He had seen Gurkhas fight with incredible courage, but this was something beyond normal courage. This was a wounded man who should have been incapacitated, fighting with the effectiveness of a full-strength squad. Bora tried to send men forward to reinforce Gurung's position. The Japanese fire was too intense. Anyone who tried to reach that forward trench would be cut down before covering half the distance. So Gurung fought alone. One man, one eye, one hand, against 200 Japanese soldiers who were determined to break through his position. The physical challenges were almost incomprehensible. The Lee Enfield rifle weighed 9 pounds. Operating the bolt action one-handed while aiming and firing required strength, coordination, and practice that Gurung had never trained for. He learned it in real time, under fire, while bleeding from dozens of wounds, while half blind, while Japanese soldiers tried to kill him every second. The pain must have been excruciating. The destroyed hand, the ruined eye, the shrapnel embedded in his body, the burns. Combat injuries produce shock. Blood loss causes weakness. Most soldiers would have passed out from the trauma. Gurung stayed conscious through sheer willpower. He had a job: hold the trench, stop the Japanese, protect his brothers in arms. Everything else was secondary, including his own survival. The Japanese couldn't understand what was happening. They outnumbered the defenders at least 50-1. They were attacking the weakest point in the British line. They had surprise and momentum. And one wounded Gurkha was stopping their entire assault. Officers tried to rally their men. Push forward, overrun that cursed trench. Every attempt met the same result. Rifle fire, dead soldiers. A voice screaming defiance from that forward position. Come and fight the Gurkhas. The attackers changed tactics. They tried flanking the trench. Gurung shifted his fire, covered the approaches. The jungle terrain limited the angles of attack. The narrow front meant the Japanese couldn't bring overwhelming force to bear all at once. They had to approach through killing zones, and Gurung covered every one. The battlefield was pitch black except when explosions briefly lit up the carnage. Gurung was firing at muzzle flashes, at sounds, at shadows, hitting targets he could barely see with a rifle he could barely operate. His section commander later tried to describe what he witnessed. He said Gurung fought like a demon, like something beyond human. Every few seconds, another Japanese soldier would fall. The enemy couldn't locate exactly where Gurung was firing from. The muzzle flash of his rifle moved as he shifted position within his trench. The Japanese fired wildly at where they thought he was. Most of their rounds missed. Gurung's rounds didn't miss. He was a trained rifleman. Even one-handed and half-blind, he was more accurate than soldiers who could see and had both hands. Time became meaningless. The battle was a continuous roar of gunfire, explosions, and screaming. Gurung fired until his rifle was empty, reloaded with his left hand, a process that normally required two hands and took seconds. One-handed, it took longer. Every second of reloading was a second the Japanese could advance. Gurung learned to reload faster, fumbled cartridges in the darkness, loaded them by feel, got the rifle back into action, started firing again. The process repeated hundreds of times through the night. The Japanese threw more grenades. Gurung couldn't avoid them all. More shrapnel wounds, more pain. He kept fighting. Blood loss was weakening him. His vision was failing from shock and injury. He could feel himself fading. But the Japanese were still attacking. If he stopped fighting, they would break through. His brothers would die. The thought was unacceptable. He fired another round, and another, and another. Ammunition became critical. Gurung had started the battle with a basic load of rifle rounds, 50 in his pouches, 10 in his rifle. He was firing steadily. Each shot had to count. He couldn't waste rounds. But he also couldn't let the Japanese close the distance. It was a razor's edge calculation. Shoot enough to keep them at bay, conserve enough to keep fighting until dawn or reinforcements arrived. He had no idea how much ammunition he had left. He just kept firing until the rifle was empty, then reloaded, then fired again. Around 3 in the morning, the intensity of the Japanese attack increased. This wasn't desperation. This was a coordinated push. Officers had rallied their men for one more attempt to break through. They came at Gurung's position from multiple angles, throwing grenades, firing machine guns, rushing forward, accepting casualties, determined to overrun that single defended position that had stopped them for over an hour. Gurung met them with the same response: rifle fire. Controlled, accurate, relentless. He was operating on pure instinct now, training so deeply ingrained that his body executed the motions without conscious thought. Aim, fire. Cycle bolt, aim, fire. His left hand moved automatically. His eye tracked targets. His rifle spoke again and again. Japanese soldiers fell. The assault broke against his trench like a wave against a cliff. By 4 in the morning, the Japanese attacks were losing momentum. The officers couldn't rally their men for another push. Too many casualties. Too many bodies in front of that cursed trench. Too much fear of the unseen demon who wouldn't die and wouldn't stop killing. The attackers pulled back, regrouped. tried to figure out what to do. They still outnumbered the defenders massively, but mass didn't matter if they couldn't bring it to bear, and bringing it to bear meant advancing through Gurung's killing zone. No one wanted to be the next soldier to die in front of that trench. Gurung used the lull to take stock. He was barely conscious. Blood loss and shock were taking their toll. His right hand hung useless. His right eye was destroyed. Shrapnel wounds covered his body. Every movement brought fresh agony. He had no idea how many rounds he had left. He felt for cartridges in his pouches. Not many. Maybe enough for one more attack. Maybe not. He didn't think about medical attention. Didn't think about evacuation. Just watched the darkness. Waited for the next assault. Kept his rifle ready. Behind him, the rest of C Company was holding their positions. They could hear the battle at Gurung's trench. They tried to provide supporting fire, but the darkness and jungle limited what they could do. Naik Bura reported the situation to his company commander. One rifleman holding the forward post alone, heavily wounded, still fighting, stopping an entire Japanese assault. The commander didn't believe it at first. Then he listened to the pattern of fire. Single rifle shots, controlled, precise, coming from that forward position. Still holding, still fighting. Reinforcements couldn't reach Gurung. The Japanese controlled the ground between his trench and the main line. Any relief attempt would be wiped out. So Gurung stayed alone, outnumbered, wounded, running out of ammunition, but still holding. The Japanese had committed their entire force to breaking through this one point. They had failed. One man had stopped them, a man who, by every rational assessment, should have been dead in the first minutes of combat. As dawn approached, the Japanese tried one final assault. This was desperation. They needed to break through before daylight, before Allied aircraft could spot them, before reinforcements arrived. They gathered their remaining strength, charged Gurung's position one more time, screaming, firing everything they had, accepting that many would die, believing that sheer numbers would finally overwhelm that single defender. Lachaman Gurung met them with his last rounds of ammunition. He fired until the rifle was empty. Then he grabbed his kukri knife, the curved blade that every Gurkha carried. If the Japanese reached his trench, he would kill them with steel, one-handed, half-blind, bleeding out. He would fight with the knife until they killed him or he killed them all. Better to die than be a coward. But the Japanese assault broke before reaching his trench. The final charge faltered. Attackers fell. The survivors pulled back into the jungle. Dawn was breaking. The darkness that had concealed them was fading. Staying meant being caught in the open, being slaughtered by Allied aircraft and artillery. The Japanese withdrew, melted back into the jungle, left their dead behind, retreated from a position they should have overrun in minutes. As the sun rose on May 13th, Naik Dabasing Bura and other Gurkhas rushed forward to Gurung's trench. They expected to find him dead. No one could survive that long under such intense attack while so badly wounded. But Lachiman Gurung was alive, barely, sitting in his trench surrounded by empty shell casings, his rifle in his lap, his kukri knife on the parapet within reach, his right hand destroyed, his right eye gone, blood everywhere. He was still conscious, still watching the jungle, still ready to fight if the Japanese came back. Bura and the others pulled him from the trench, gave him water, applied field dressings to his wounds. The damage was catastrophic. His right hand would never function again. His right eye was gone. Shrapnel wounds covered his body. Burns needed treatment. He had lost massive amounts of blood, but he was alive, and his trench had held. The Japanese had failed to break through. The entire C Company perimeter was intact, because one rifleman had refused to let them pass. Medical evacuation came quickly. Gurung was carried to the rear. Field surgeons worked on him for hours. They saved his life, but couldn't save his hand or eye. The hand was amputated. Just a stump remained where his right hand had been. The right eye was permanently blind. Shrapnel fragments were removed from his body. Burns were treated. He would survive, but he would never be the same. While Gurung was being evacuated, other Gurkhas examined the battlefield around his trench. What they found astonished them. 31 dead Japanese soldiers lay within a few yards of his position. 31 confirmed kills, all shot by one man, with one hand, in 4 hours of continuous combat. The physical evidence told the story better than words. Blood trails showed where wounded Japanese had been dragged away. Equipment scattered across the ground indicated many more casualties beyond the confirmed dead. Gurung had single-handedly stopped an assault by at least 200 soldiers. The recommendation for the Victoria Cross was immediate. Naik Debasing Bora wrote a detailed report of what he had witnessed. The company commander endorsed it. Battalion command forwarded it up the chain. This was the kind of action that defined heroism. One man holding an impossible position against overwhelming odds, fighting despite catastrophic wounds, never retreating, never surrendering, saving his entire company through sheer willpower and skill. If any action deserved the highest decoration for valor, this was it. The Victoria Cross citation was approved and published in the London Gazette on August 9, 1945, just days before the war ended. The citation read in part, Rifleman Lachaman Gurung was manning the most forward post of his platoon, which bore the brunt of an attack by at least 200 of the Japanese enemy. Twice he hurled back grenades which had fallen on his trench, but the third exploded in his right hand, blowing off his fingers, shattering his arm, and severely wounding him in the face, body, and right leg. His two comrades were also badly wounded, but the rifleman, now alone and disregarding his wounds, loaded and fired his rifle with his left hand for 4 hours, calmly waiting for each attack which he met with fire at point-blank range. Afterwards, when the wounded were counted, it is reported that there were 31 dead Japanese around his position which he had killed, with only one arm. The citation didn't capture the full horror of what Gurung endured. 4 hours of continuous combat, bleeding, half-blind, in agony, operating a rifle one-handed in complete darkness, fighting an enemy that outnumbered him 50-1. No support, no reinforcement, no retreat. Just duty and courage and the Gurkha code. Better to die than be a coward. Gurung recovered in military hospitals. The war ended while he was still being treated. Japan surrendered in August. The Burma campaign was over. Gurung would never see combat again. His fighting days were finished. But his life was far from over. He returned to Nepal, to his village, to his family, missing an eye and a hand, carrying the Victoria Cross, the highest military decoration in the British Commonwealth. Only 13 Gurkhas have ever received it. Gurung was one of them. Life after the war was difficult. He couldn't farm effectively with one hand. The British government provided a small pension for Victoria Cross recipients. It wasn't much. Gurung struggled financially for years. He married, had children, tried to build a normal life. But he was famous in Nepal, the one-handed Gurkha who had killed 31 Japanese soldiers. People treated him with immense respect. Children learned his story in school. He became a living symbol of Gurkha courage. In 1995, 50 years after his action at Tong Da, Gurung was invited to London for Victoria Cross commemorations. He traveled to Britain, met with other VC recipients, was honored by Queen Elizabeth II, attended ceremonies at the Imperial War Museum. People wanted to hear his story, wanted to understand how he had done what he did. Gurung's answers were always simple. I was a Gurkha. I had my duty. I did what needed doing. He lived in Nepal for the rest of his life. The British government eventually increased pensions for Gurkha veterans. Gurung received better support in his later years. He became an advocate for Gurkha welfare, spoke about the need to care for aging veterans, reminded people that soldiers from Nepal had served Britain faithfully for generations and deserved respect and support. His voice carried weight. He was a living legend, a Victoria Cross holder, someone who had proven courage beyond any doubt. Lachaman Gurung died on December 12, 2010. He was 92 years old. His death was mourned across Nepal and Britain. News organizations covered his passing. Military units honored his memory. He was cremated, according to Hindu tradition. His Victoria Cross medal was preserved for future generations. The story of his one-man stand was told again in obituaries and remembrances. How one rifleman had done what should have been impossible. How courage and duty had overcome injury and odds. How a Gurkha had shown the world what better to die than be a coward actually meant. His legacy endures in multiple ways. The 8th Gurkha Rifles, now part of the Indian Army, teach his story to every new recruit. Young Gurkhas learn about Lachiman Gurung the same way Gurung learned about heroes from earlier generations. The cycle continues. The Gurkha Museum in Winchester, England, displays information about Gurung's action. Visitors can read his Victoria Cross citation, see photographs of him, understand what he accomplished on that night in May 1945. But perhaps the most important legacy is what his story represents. Lachiman Gurung was not superhuman. He was 5 feet tall in a world that preferred taller soldiers. He came from a poor farming family in Nepal. He had no special advantages, no elite training, no advanced weapons. What he had was duty, courage, the willingness to stand his ground when every instinct screamed at him to run, the refusal to quit when quitting would have been entirely justified. The Japanese soldiers who attacked his position that night were not cowards. They were experienced fighters. They had conquered most of Asia. They fought with fanatical determination. They outnumbered Gurung massively. They had every tactical advantage, except one. They didn't have a Gurkha in their way. And that one Gurkha refused to let them pass. Refused to die. Refused to fail his duty. The Japanese couldn't understand it. Couldn't overcome it. Couldn't break through. 200 soldiers stopped by one wounded man who simply would not quit. Modern soldiers study Gurung's action in military academies, trying to understand the psychology of it, trying to quantify the factors that allowed him to accomplish what he did. The truth is simpler than the analysis. Gurung was trained. He was brave. He was committed to his brothers in arms. When the moment came, he did what Gurkhas have always done. He fought. He didn't calculate odds or consider alternatives. He had a job. Hold the trench. He held it. Everything else was irrelevant. The physical challenges alone should have stopped him. Operating a bolt-action rifle one-handed requires both hands. Loading requires both hands. Aiming accurately with one eye in pitch darkness is nearly impossible. Staying conscious with catastrophic injuries and blood loss defies medical expectations. Gurung did all of it, not because he was invulnerable, but because he accepted no alternative. The trench would hold because he was in it. The Japanese would not pass because he would not let them. Simple as that. There's a temptation to view actions like Gurung's as aberrations, impossible feats that normal soldiers couldn't replicate. But Gurung would reject that interpretation. He considered himself an ordinary Gurkha doing his duty. Nothing special, nothing superhuman. Just a rifleman who refused to quit. His message to future generations was clear. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's fighting despite fear. Duty isn't following orders when it's easy. It's doing your job when it's impossible. Honor isn't winning. It's refusing to lose. The trench where Lachiman Gurung made his stand no longer exists. The Burmese jungle has reclaimed that hillside. The battlefield is gone. The physical evidence eroded by time and weather. But the story remains, passed down through Gurkha regiments, taught to new soldiers, remembered by historians, celebrated by a grateful Britain and Nepal. 31 dead Japanese soldiers, 4 hours of hell, one hand, one eye, one Gurkha who simply would not die. When people ask how he did it, the answer is both simple and profound. He was a Gurkha. Better to die than be a coward. On May 13, 1945, Lachiman Gurung proved that maxim wasn't just words. It was reality. It was duty. It was who he was. The Japanese learned that lesson the hardest way possible, and the world learned what one man with one hand could accomplish when he simply refused to quit. If this story moved you, we'd be honored if you'd like this video. Stories like these take days of research to bring to light. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten heroes from World War II. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible story from the greatest generation. We want to hear from you. In the comments below, tell us where you're watching from, your country and city. Many of you served in the military or had fathers and grandfathers who fought in this war. Did you know someone who served with Gurkha regiments? Have you heard similar stories of soldiers who fought against impossible odds? Share your memories and thoughts below. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering these stories. Lachaman Gurung deserved more than a brief mention in history books. He deserved to be remembered as the warrior he was, and we're here to make sure that happens.